So, good afternoon, everyone. It's the first time I've ever read anything off my phone, so bear with me, my eyesight's not so great. Thank you for coming to the second Carnival event, New Architecture Writers Learning from Venice, which coincides with the last week of the Biennale College Architettura. My thanks to Units 2 and 5 for hosting and working with this year's fantastic N.A.W. cohort of aspiring writers and tutors. The N.A.W. teams will introduce themselves in a moment, but I would just like to take a couple of minutes to say something about today's event and why it's been included in the Carnival lineup of events. When I began thinking about the meetings on architecture, which historically and traditionally takes place towards the end of the Biennale, I wanted to interpret the format in a way that sat within the framework of the Laboratory of the Future, thematically as well as structurally. In the invitation letter to participants, I wrote that architects generally communicate their ideas and convictions through drawings, photographs, texts, and various forms of digital media. However, for the most part, architects' drawings and texts are hermetic languages understood by few outside the discipline. If architectural discourse aims to have greater and more direct impact beyond its own boundaries, new and more generous and accessible forms of communication are required. The Carnival program of events during the Laboratory of the Future offers a space for communication throughout the 6 months of the exhibition and is regarded in itself as a participant. It offers a space in which words, views, perspectives, and opinions are traded, heard, analyzed, and remembered, hopefully. Politicians, policymakers, poets, writers, students, activists, community organizers, architects, and public intellectuals will share a stage. Curating a public events platform is increasingly a form of architectural practice that attempts to bridge the gulf between architects and the public. Dr. Cindy Waters, one of the N.A.W. tutors, sent me a quote by Bakhtin, which, as is often the way, echoed something that I was already reading by Bakhtin. And the quote reads that Carnival does not acknowledge any distinction between actors and spectators. It is not a spectacle seen by the people, they live in it, and everyone participates because its very idea embraces all the people. It has a universal spirit. It is a special condition of the entire world, of the world's revival and renewal in which all take part. This isn't strictly true of the formats of various Carnival events. We're still in a lecture hall. There's still a separation between audience and speaker. This is still an academic or semi-academic performance. But the reading I mentioned, the second reading by Bakhtin, has to do with the word rehearsal, which is very much the spirit of this event and others like it in the program. Bakhtin coined the word dialogic to refer to a discussion that does not revolve itself by finding common ground. Although no shared agreements may be reached, through the process of exchange, people may become more aware of their own views and expand their understanding of one another. He called it a knitted together but divergent exchange. Participants are not always on the same page, but the result has more texture, more complexity, and more depth. This event, New Architecture Writers Learning from Venice, has many meanings, many ambitions, and many forms. It is ostensibly about writing, but not exclusively. Writing, too, takes many forms, has multiple meanings and multiple ambitions. The emphasis on new in New Architecture Writers refers not only to who those writers are, but what they see, what they say, how it, how it is received, and who will come after them. This event is a rehearsal for a project whose time frame is as ambitious and expansive as the project of constructing an architectural canon over the past 500 years has been. A small, necessary, and sometimes very uncertain step. So thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Leslie, for that. That was a really kind way to introduce new architecture writers, and again, thank you for the invitation, for being here. congratulations on a really extraordinary Biennale. I think your vision, and I hope, shifts the genre for how we see architecture, for how we make architecture. I am Thomas Aquilina. I am an architect and an academic based at the Royal College of Art in London, and I co-direct New Architecture Writers with historian Tom Wilkinson, who you will see on stage later. New Architecture Writers is an experiment in radical architectural pedagogy. And now in its 5th iteration, it remains a free program for 12 months and based in London that offers emerging writers of color an opportunity to develop their critical voice, expand their editorial connections, and really hone their writing skills. We are here with the 5th cohort, who are looking fantastic at the front of the auditorium as part of a writing residency. And each of the members have been reviewing a part of the Biennale in recent days. So this event will be in 3 sections. First, I'll present an overview of New Architecture Writers and sort of where we are after 5 years. And then I'll be joined on stage with Nana Biamah Ofosu, who many of you will probably know from being a tutor in the Biennale College, but who was also an alumna of the 2nd cohort a few years ago. Second, 2 of our current members of New Architecture Writers, Toby and Mia, will be leading a discussion on the future of architectural writing, and will be joined by Ellis Woodman on stage, and as well Alice Grandoit Šutka, Emmanuel Olunkwa, and Manon Mollard online. And then third, we'll have a demonstration of one of our pedagogical tools, what we think of as a live editing session, where we'll have text on screen and we'll sort of pull and push words around and what could be quite a fun and maybe lively discussion. So I suppose similarly, I want to think about an introduction to New Architecture Writers through 3 themes. And the first is an experiment in pedagogy. And the second, I'll talk about ways of writing. And then third, we'll think through writing as resistance. So I suppose in this way, what I want to do is kind of offer up the program's ambitions and its necessity, and to kind of raise thoughts around power and representation and diversity. So from the very outset, this program has been an experiment. Founded in 2017, started by Tom Wilkinson and Finn Harper, there was no precedent for how New Architecture Writers could be formed. And actually you see me here as a very young, fresh-faced 20-something in that first cohort. And actually since the 2nd group, I've been tutor and then co-director. And I suppose as an experiment, what we've been trying to figure out and figure through is how do we offer up new forms of writing, but also new forms of teaching? And one of the ways we do that is we put the very members themselves at the center of the program. The program has sort of 3 criteria: that you are under 30, so you are an emerging practitioner, to use the term favored by Leslie. Second, it is you identify as a person of color. And third, you be based in London. We recognize these have certain limitations, and we've at times had certain kickback, but it allows us to form, I think, a very special set of cohorts, each time 9 members as a group. And the reason for a small cohort is it allows for an atmosphere of intimacy. So here you see then the 3rd and the 4th cohort, and more recently, taken just 2 days ago, and with us in the room, the 5th cohort. So this is a program that's been iterated over these successive years, and it's a program that has evolved, but one thing that remains very core to the program is this idea of building a kind of a peer-to-peer network, that rather than think of writing and writers as solitary figures, we want to think of them in conversation with each other. And hopefully that will come through shortly. But I suppose with the kind of current background that has sort of stemmed from the States at the moment and the Supreme Court ruling against positive discrimination, it feels very important to have this particular conversation and to recognize the necessity of this program. I've laid out here the objectives of New Architecture Writers, but you could distill this down to say that the aim of the program is to bring new voices at different frequencies into architectural writing. And I think what's really important is to also understand that although this is an initiative that Tom and I lead on, it requires support and the power from others. And so Ellis, who's in the room, who will join us later, sort of spearheads the Architectural Foundation. You see that very close relationship that we have, and then also with the Architectural Review, who have offered always a kind of a paid commission at the end of the program for the members. And one of the ways to think about architectural writing is to also think about it as a career, and that these words matter, but that these words can also provide a source of income for some of these members. And so this is the way we're structured. You'll see there an advisory board of some really important and some really significant figures in the profession, and they've sort of been able to support and encourage us throughout. And again, thank you, Leslie. But we've done this in support and with the help, and we've in many ways relied on the generosity of our collaborators. This list, every time I present this, gets longer and longer. So now we're at the third column. It's getting smaller, and the typeface is getting a little bit tinier. But I counted here about 102 collaborators, and some of the names might be familiar and others less so. And part of this idea of an experiment in pedagogy is to also ensure that the people that we bring into the program are also evolving. And so I think it's fair to say that the people who now contribute on the program are quite different to those who contributed in the first cohort. But it's an expanding field, and that gives us great hope in many ways. And there are those who return year on year and sort of keep us sharp. I also went and asked some of the past members what they might think of the program, and you see here the voice of Nana among others. But there were other sort of ways to think about new architecture writers that I think were kind of useful to think about. So Nima, from the third cohort, thought the program was influential, ambitious, demanding, exhausting, and exciting. And whereas Awi thought that the people she met will continue to inspire her for years on end, and that she feels indebted to how the program has set about a new direction for her. And I don't know if Shumi's in the room, but Shumi's been an incredible supporter for the program and a really key friend. And here we are during those pandemic years where we started to shift to a digital space. But it's really important that we maintain this kind of peer-to-peer group setting, and this idea that writing can be done and thought of as a collective exercise. So this was sort of immediately after one of the UK lockdowns. And then what we've also done in this kind of experiment in pedagogy and having no fixed base is seek out new forms of inter-institutional relationships. So here we are at the Cosmic House last year, and the likes of Cosmic House and Sound Advice, the AFI, among others, have become kind of critical partners in trying to expand the way we think about architectural writing and criticism. And what's quite nice about our relationship with the Cosmic House is that we get to keep sort of Charles Jenks on his toes. And at times we also get outside. One of my own forms of practice is to think about walking, and here we are taking a guided tour through North Kensington in West London. Which moves me on to, I suppose, this idea of ways of writing. And I think what always sort of fascinates many people when we present new architecture writers to a new audience is that writing can be conceived of in multiple ways, maybe what we might say as many registers. So this is this year's syllabus as 6 modules. And we see here the news brief, the build-in study, the curatorial writing, I'm trying to read backwards, the exhibition review, and then penultimately the guided tour, and finish up with the open brief. The first 2 are kind of really core to the project of the program, which is news writing and build-in study, which gives the members the kind of the foundation to think through the kind of bread and butter of architectural production or architectural writing and criticism. But then the later pieces of work that we ask of them shifts in tone, in audience, and in style. We have now, over these 5 years, explored 13 different briefs, from the essay to the podcast to the opinion piece to the interview. So it's a way to kind of, if you like, constantly have the program as an experiment, that we're always trying to iterate what we might provide. And so, for example, this year, knowing that we'd be here today for this A Moment in Venice, we try to think about the arc of the program that allowed us to experiment with curatorial writing as a way for the members to be better informed for how they might read and review the Biennale, how they might approach it with a more critical lens, but also understand how the curatorial decisions were taken to put things side by side, how a journey through the exhibition might play out. And I'm going to just sort of share some of these examples, but before I just want to say something actually, which, we have limitations as a program, and at times I think some of the feedback is, why aren't we doing more creative writing? But what we also want to do is to offer up ways that can be monetizable, that can also be very accessible. And so I think Tom and I will sort of spend a lot of time trying to sort of eke out the kind of academic tendencies so that the words can be made more accessible and can sort of reach and connect with a much wider audience. And so here are some examples of these types of writing. I mentioned that the news writing is really the way that we kind of get them to think about making language accessible from the beginning. And this is usually a really valuable first step that we take. And here, Betty is writing about I guess the dysfunction of the RIBA, as you might expect, for those who are with us from a British background. The build-in study is a piece of text that reviews typically a building. In this case, Aude was looking at a new master plan for Burkina Faso, and she did a good job at reviewing, sort of a review of that master plan scheme to come. And then as well, we sort of tested out some mini podcasts, or what we called micro podcasts. And this was a moment in which I think the members, this is 2 years ago, started to realize that the spoken word is very different to the written word. And so their scripts became really quite different. And what I want to do actually is introduce their voices. I mentioned a moment ago that really the kind of core project of N.A.W. is new voices at different frequencies. So I'm going to just play for you a clip from the Critical Flaneur, which is Nima alongside Leila and Teshoma.
Hello, and welcome to the first New Architecture Writers podcast. I'm Leila.
I'm Nima.
And Teshoma.
And today we're discussing whether architecture has a role to play in safer cities.
On the evening of March the 3rd, 2021, Sarah Everard, a 33-year-old woman, went missing while walking home after leaving a friend's house in Clapham. A week later, her body was discovered in Kent. It was soon discovered she had been kidnapped and murdered by a serving police officer. The horrific circumstances surrounding her disappearance have sparked national outrage about women's safety.
The ubiquitous text when you're home, so many of us are accustomed to, speaks of not only fear but also solidarity, recognising the shared existence that our body safety in public space is not guaranteed. Text me when you're home has become as much a request as it has a farewell to mark the end of the night. Leslie Kern writes in A Feminist City, "As a woman, my everyday urban experiences are deeply gendered. My gender identity shapes how I move through the city, how I live my day-to-day, and the choices available to me. My gender is more than my body, but my body is the site of my lived experience." So writing about the city from the site of a woman's body reveals the city in a new light.
There has been much discussion within architecture about how our built environment evidences the sexism within our society.
This raises questions about the very makeup of our city. Who is the city really designed for? How can women and marginalized communities feel safe and connected in an environment which is not designed for them?
So that's just a segment from the kind of critical flaneur piece that was sort of in total about 11 minutes long. And the other examples there that we see is to kind of think about the allotment, this was just coming out of the pandemic, and looking for access to spaces, but also collectivity in the city. And as well, this idea around the critical role of the graffiti on the tube, on the underground in London. So it's that's piece. And I think to come back to this idea earlier about the criteria, that making a program that's London-based is also a way to really look critically and with a sort of a deep approach or a deep perspective at London. I just want to return to this quickly and actually mention two things, which is that in this idea of making an experimental pedagogical program is also to think about how we make it public, which is to maintain the small size of the cohort, just 9 members. We see it as necessary to have 2 key public moments in the program. So that's always the third brief, so in this case, the kind of golden block, and then the last brief, the sort of tan block, which we call the open brief. And these are 2 moments where we are kind of, we sort of engage in a very public audience or discourse. And we'll go through that later, what we usually call N.A.W. Live. So maybe you might think of this as Venice Live. And that, I think, has become a really interesting way to reckon with a different syllabus. In the words, putting words and voices in the public domain. And it offers up a challenge for the members too. And we've also looked at guided tours. This was a really successful piece from Abiba, who was offering up a guided tour through Brixton in London, and reflects on the squatter handbook, but as well as the Stephen Lawrence inquiry. And then Alistair last year was thinking about Broadwater Farm. And so really, we set out the brief with very clear parameters, but then we allow the members to kind of, if you like, bring their own interests to bear. So here, Alistair was really interested in thinking about Broadwater Farm as an estate that might well be demolished or certainly regenerated. And so he wanted to think about a tour that could, if you like, memorialize this particular estate. But here what we see, which is really interesting, is how words become images. I'm going to play a little segment of this.
This here, this mural is like iconic. This is what everyone remembers when you say Broadwater Farm.
And then there's things like opinion pieces, which you may be more familiar with. And here, Krish was making an argument for more play space, more play in the city, a city that could become, I suppose, more agile, and I suppose a bit more risky. I mentioned earlier that we want to make the syllabus more public, or think about the kind of publicness in the way that we share the work of the program. And this was the very first attempt at that. It was called The Time for Failure Is Now. And this was way back in, I think, 2018. And you can see how bad the graphics are. And they got a lot better next year when we thought about drawing the edge to the center. And here we're kind of at the RCA's auditorium space. And we had in conversation there engineers and as well podcasters, among others. And so to think about how the writing of the members can also reach out and connect with very different disciplines within architecture, but beyond to the built environment. And then we sort of changed up the format with the third cohort, who had this idea of a seat at the table, and so essentially just hosted an amazing dinner at Waterloo City Farm. Again, we've invited guests. And what was interesting here is one of the guests, Jonathan Nunn, was introduced to some of the members in the audience, who then goes on later to co-write a book about food in the city. And so in a way, what we start to realize is how we can start to make initial connections through trying to platform other voices or new unheard perspectives, but then that might later on take on a kind of a momentum of their own. And then last year, our most ambitious event to date, which was called Language Barriers, which is recognizing that as the program, we address race, but we are unable, through its limitation, to address other protected characteristics. And so here we made a very clear attempt to think about an intersection between ability, gender, geography, among other characteristics, and how to make a space for that. And this was hosted at the Zaha Hadid Foundation in London. And just kind of an interesting thing about this is that in setting up the working group for this event, we realized that these are the most accessible graphics to be seen as a colorway. We realized that the Zaha Hadid Foundation had to put in a disabled toilet that they were initially reluctant to do. So even a small physical intervention, we started to recognize the kind of impact that we can have in event making, in sort of caretaking for the city. And I think language barriers is also a way to say, actually, who has the right to, who has the ability to write, who pays for these words, and who listens. And this is kind of how it was hosted. This was last summer, and COVID came back, and then suddenly we had to, do hybrid events. So here we are with a sort of a mixed audience. And that's online, and thanks to Ellis and the team at the AF, there's a few of these different segments of that event that are now accessible via the AF's channels. And just to end on this kind of third and final theme of writing as resistance, which has perhaps never really been the driver or the ethos of the program. But what we've come to recognize over the years is how New Architecture Writers has been able to empower its cohorts, how it's been able to provide a place for a kind of collective identity. That for many young people who want to join the program, who are on the program, see it as instructive for how they can provide resistance to things that they feel from outside. And I suppose one of the ways this is initiated is through that final brief, what we call the open brief. And if the whole program is an experiment itself. Well, actually, this is the place where the members themselves get to experiment on their own terms. And so to come back to when I started out as cohort 1, we produced this magazine called After Party. And in that, at the very end, I write a letter called Figures of Thought. And this was addressed to Adrian Lahoud, a mentor of mine. And here I write about sort of the crucible of social struggle and architecture as a kind of mental struggle, a kind of mental space. And I talk about it as the personal is always social, the architect as general practitioner, and fragility not as failure. And that to me was a really important moment for me to think about resistance through writing, practice as writing. And here we are kind of hosting that event. The second cohort, we're back in the pandemic. Nano and Co. Took over the AF's channels for a whole month. I think this was October. And the first event was to kind of think about that theme of drawing the edge to the center. And then asked the question, or rather posed power versus Palladio. And then this one which was quite fun, which was learning how to say no, and as instructed by Rosa Parks. And then this is also really fun because the very author of this book turned up on the Zoom call. We haven't yet co-authored the next edition, but that should come. But and this was kind of, again, this idea of new architecture writers as a kind of intervention. So here they are kind of intervening in what we think we might know from architecture school. The third cohort wanted to kind of really think about the intimacy of the program. And so this is the group that had previously thought about food and city with a seat at the table. Now they're thinking about when I get home. Solange was a key reference. And here they produced this pamphlet. And in this instance, Ella, who Managé knows well, is talking about the steel, the space of the steel home, or the space of the steel house, which is, and I think this is kind of quite applicable, particularly for this event of Carnival, and to kind of pick up on Leslie's comments earlier about rehearsal. So the steel house as a place where people gather and practice in advance of the Notting Hill Carnival. And what was really nice about this event was, again, it was a kind of a reimagining of how events could be. So an event where it was small-sized, it was designed as a living room, shoes off, plants gathered, rugs unfurled. And then last year, the fourth cohort wanted to take over the airwaves, and so they literally called it air rights. So kind of a reclaiming, and they made this full day-long broadcast where they explored all different kinds of ways to think about access to air, air quality, the inequity of air, particularly in a city like London. And these are the ranges of perspectives. And one of the things that the members often do is try to draw on their own diasporic histories or diasporic heritages. And so we see this in the case, for example, of the lungs to Lagos. And here they are kind of presenting, at the end of that broadcast, some reflections on stage. And so what's really important isn't just the bringing the members together, but it's the building of community, the people we put in the audience, and in many ways, yourselves this afternoon. But also, we're in the press, which I suppose is one of the kind of key drivers of the program, which is to literally put these voices, these names, these people in places like Vice, Icon, and the Architectural Review, among others. And we were also in Venice this year, so here we see a whole range of past cohorts from 1, 2, 3, and 4. All of them, this is all taken during the press opening, the press week of this Biennale. And it became very clear to us that the kind of the audience of the Biennale was not only more youthful, not only was it less white than ever before, and these are obviously long overdue changes, but that the very participants, those who felt they had a claim on such a globally important and prestigious event could be ours or could be theirs. And we see here all kinds of ways of participating. So whether that's as reporters, some of the words of these past members featured in the Architect's Journal, in eFlux, in Dezeen, among other places. And not to mention, for example, Nana, who was behind the V&A's display on tropical modernism. Alongside Lois, she also was part of the research group of the main curatorial team, and many others, and I probably have but anyway, and to, I suppose, kind of conclude, actually, I shared earlier that After Party was a production that came out of the end of the first cohort, out of that open brief. Well, actually, that collective, of which I'm a co-founder member, continue, and we made a second issue sort of last year, and it's seems to kind of, if you like, think about this very genre of writing and voice. And in it, I have another letter. In this case, I write to Baroness Lawrence. And the writing in this actually, in many ways, I think picks up on a conversation I had of Leslie a few years ago, which is the different forms of practice. And I offer up here 3 different forms of practice, and one of them most obvious to us, perhaps building buildings, maybe less so, maybe sort of more akin to an academic space, building knowledge. But if you like, what really, I suppose, New Architecture Writers is about is a form of building coalition. And that's kind of what I kind of offer up in this piece of text. So as I suppose a closing remark, what I'd like to say is, sort of outside the sort of traditional spaces of education of studio, New Architecture Writers sort of fills a gap. It kind of makes an opportunity for new ideas and new communities to exist. It makes a space for us to sort of be heard and be seen and not be ignored. I'm now going to invite Nana to join me on stage. And the idea being that Nana can offer us her own perspective through the program, and someone who's sort of, flying and whose star is kind of shining so bright, and we're so proud. But I also want to use this moment just to say thank you to everyone here. Thank you to Leslie. Thank you to Cindy and to Ellis, who've joined us in Venice. Thank you to the Architecture Foundation for the continued support. It's not easy doing this, and it's certainly not easy trying to fundraise to keep this thing going. But hopefully I've offered up why it's so necessary and why it's so critical. So thanks for listening. And now, if Nana, who if you should know, is a co-founder of YAA Projects, and as I mentioned, a contributor and an exhibitor at this Biennale, and as well a researcher at the AFI. So please, everyone, welcome Nana. Okay. I didn't get many laughs, in the presentation.
I'm not that funny either, so.
Okay.
There we go.
So I want to ask, really, I suppose, 3 key questions, Nana, and we've got about, I guess, 15 minutes or so to kind of tease them out. And the first question I want to say is kind of, you're part of the second cohort of New Architecture Writers. I think at a point where the program was starting to kind of figure out its shape. In the first year, it was sort of 18 months long, and then the second year, it became 12 months, and now we have a very sort of clear sort of sense of how to deliver 6 briefs with a certain kind of tempo and rhythm. Can you just reflect on your personal experiences of the program?
Yeah, sure. So as Thomas has mentioned, I was part of the second cohort of the program. And I think one thing that was really important actually was to have been able to see how the first cohort ran and what they were able to achieve, what the aims of it were. And I remember seeing an advert for the first cohort, which I missed by a couple of days, and being really upset and thinking, this looks brilliant and actually like something that is really necessary. Because before then, the only ways that I think myself and a lot of young practitioners understood writing could be was as a journalist or in an academic context. And actually what the space that the New Architecture Writers program provided was a real opening up of how writing could be used as a practice. So I was educated in the way that really did treat writing as kind of secondary to how an architect builds and how they kind of develop ideas. And I think there was a real moment in the program where I could see how writing is completely and inherently linked to how we build as practitioners. I think beyond just a group or a course thinking about architectural writing, it was really also the makeup of the group. And I think that that's also a really important thing that the program provides. So 9 members, all under 30, but from quite different backgrounds, not always architecture students. Some of us were graduates, others were working in related fields of architecture or doing something aligned with architecture. And I think that space was really important, and also to think about the different mix of people. I think of putting together a group like that a bit like hosting a good party. It's about who you invite, where you're going to have them sit, and what kind of conversations you might get out of that seating arrangement. And over a course of 12 months, it's like a really well-rehearsed party. You get to know who you sort of talk to, how you build ideas together, and really form a space that allows you to imagine. And I think for me, that was a real turning point in how I thought about my own practice, because I finally felt as though I had the time, I had the community of people to be in conversation with and dialogue with, and to think through certain ideas together. And I think that's a really important thing that happens as part of the New Architecture Writers, that you're not thinking alone, but you're thinking in conversation with others.
I guess that's also something we spoke about yesterday when we had that seminar, which is sociality. In yesterday's case, through walk-in, but in this case, I suppose through writing. I want to know kind of quite specifically, what did you learn on New Architecture Writers? And if you can just kind of offer up some very specific examples, because I think hopefully my overview gave a sense of the program, but it'd be really good to hear what you picked up and how those have started to resonate even now.
So I think I mentioned earlier, the forms of writing I was used to are very much in a kind of academic context. But I think through the different briefs, you really got to understand how writing for a very specific idea or set of circumstances can be different. So, for instance, briefs such as podcasting were really interesting, because I think there's something amazing about the relationship between the written word and the spoken word and how you construct those. I think you picked up on that in your presentation. But I listen to podcasts quite a lot, but I certainly never kind of thought about the ways in which an argument is constructed and how much so you can do that through writing, and then also think about how those words translate into spoken sound. So I come from a culture that builds a world from voice and tells stories. So how do you begin to use that writing to underpin that? And also, our month-long series on the Architecture Foundation takeover was something we really enjoyed. It was at the height of COVID. We thought, oh my goodness. But again, you start to see how writing offers a space for others. So by curating, thinking through together a set of events, we were able to offer space for other people, to offer room for others to join us in thinking through how we might use writing differently. In a way, it's a way of collective well-building, to think about how you can transform where you are, and at that point, alone in your home, but you felt and connected to so many other people, and you could use writing as an instigator for kind of larger conversations about social justice, racial justice, climate. So it was a really, I think, all those things are still underpinned by writing as an act, but they are manifested very differently.
You know, also what you, I think, did with that takeover, a series of events that practically every day there was something happening. It was an intense digital experience, but you put words always at the center of what you were doing. So whether that was taking a book and trying to deconstruct it and intervene within the space of the book, or whether it was how you say no and really trying to like understand the power in the word no, which I still haven't yet fully understood what to do with that. But I know you also wanted to think about how N.A.W. makes a space particularly for writers of color and why that's significant. Can you just kind of elaborate on that?
Sure. So the second event in that, Power versus Palladio, was a really significant one for us. And that came actually from a conversation after your first event, talking to a critic about the program and what kind of space it offered. And we started to talk about what the expectations of a program like New Architecture Writers would be, and that I think most people saw it as a program that might train new voices, but perhaps not any differently to what's already happening. So it might just continue a kind of tradition of architectural writing that we're very familiar with. And I think Power versus Palladio was really an opportunity to ask how writing is different for those who have been otherwise excluded. And from that conversation, for me, it made me really think about why writers of color, traditionally who have been excluded, would want to carry on the status quo, using writing the same way, just about architectural journalism. And how actually the way forward might be to find new ways of using writing as a kind of liberatory space, a space to celebrate, a space to foreground your interest rather than always reacting against the tide. And so in thinking about Power versus Palladio, we put together, it was a panel discussion. We're very grateful that Professor Leslie Loco could join us in that discussion. We also invited people like Rowan Moore, Owen Hatherley, Tom Dykoff, who are all writers in London. In a way, again, to convene a discussion about how writing becomes a space for which to speak to power.
But I think there's another way to also think about that, which is, and particularly to address this idea of writing as a person of color, which is that it's not to only always write in the way that's expected of us, but to write through your own voice, to hone your own expression, but then to do that in both forms that are new and old.
Yeah.
So kind of the Palladio, if you like, is the kind of the sort of the architectural review, but then the after party is the kind of the new genre. And I think we are both passionate about making sure we can operate in both domains. And that's something that I think hopefully we'll tease out in the next part of the conversation with Toby and Mia. maybe a sort of a last question. What would you say, or how would you say new architecture writers now is contributing to your current practice? And how do you conceptualize what that practice is?
I really do think that without this program, I wouldn't have been brave enough to think about other ways to practice as an architect. And so I think that is really the power of a space like this. I run a practice in London called YA Projects, and I set that up as a way to think about my architectural writing through making, speaking, and writing. And in some ways to hold those three factions with a certain equilibrium, which I don't think I would have been brave enough or conscious of without this program. So it's that is a tangible, I'd say, benefit and lasting legacy of a program like this. And in some ways, those three parts for me are all equal in how we think about places, about spaces, and how we design our cities to be able to speak about architecture, to be able to write about it, adds to how you're able to construct it. And I think those, often they're presented in quite binarized ways, and actually to be able to formulate a practice that is thinking about those three elements collectively in conversation with one another has been a really important thing that new architecture writers provided. And I suppose for me, another really important thing was it's helped me contemplate the role of an architect towards a future practice. I think more than ever, especially in the context of this Biennale, the Laboratory of the Future, to really start to think about the architect as a translator, as the person or voice that is able to go between the past, stay in the present, but also occupy the future. And I think that's where architects need to see themselves, and writing has been a really tangible way to mediate between those conditions. Yeah.
That's amazing, and I think it's so beautiful to hear how significant this pivot was in your recent and emergent journey in practice, and how expansive you see practice. I recognize that in many ways that's like the perfect summary, right? But I want to just sort of say that I think at its core, new architecture writers is sort of creating visibility. There's often that term, make invisible the invisible, and our words and our voices, I think, are doing that. But it also does something else. It also, I think, offers up the next generation of culture makers, and therefore sort of making culture more diverse, or rethinking what culture might actually be if we're at the center of it. But I would like, at the moment, to take a short break, and what we'll do then is we'll set up part two of our event, where Toby and Mia will come up and lead the next part of this. And we'll be joined by friends on screen. We'll have the, they'll do the introduction, so it'll be fine. But yeah, if everyone can just take a 4-minute break, and then we'll pick it up, okay? Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi everyone, I hope you're all feeling rejuvenated after the break. My name's Mir, and
Hi, I'm Toby.
And we're here to represent the 5th cohort of the new architecture writers. So the second session will focus on architectural writing and publishing. We'd like to take this opportunity to thank the Biennale, Leslie, for the invitation, and for our panelists joining us from London and the US. So on screen, we have Manon Mollard, who's the editor of the Architectural Review in London, Ellis Grandoit Šutka, who's the editorial director and co-founder of Deem Journal. And we will also have Emmanuel Olunkwa, who's the editor of Pin Up. And so, as I said earlier, we're here representing the cohort, which we've just had Thomas introduce. And we've been very fortunate to be here in Venice for the past few days, immersed within the Biennale and the city. And the output is writing a review of a particular installation or section of the Biennale. And I'm very intrigued to see what comes of this discussion.
Yeah, so really Mir and I are here to ask questions to our panelists as stand-ins for the wider cohort and as part of the work we've been doing in Venice and more generally during the program. We've collected a number of questions about architectural writing and publishing, and we've divided them into 4 sections that we're going to talk about today. And so they're representation, the changing media landscape, experimental writing, and then finally the relationship between writing and practice. And I wanted to start not by listing the accomplishments of each of our panelists, but instead by inviting them to share a bit about how they came into architectural writing. And so maybe Ellis, you want to start because you're here with us?
Of course, thank you. Hello, my name is Ellis Woodman. I'm the director at the Architecture Foundation, which is a job that I've been doing for about 7 years. And I began my career as a practicing architect. And in 2003, after about 7 years in practice, I began writing professionally. And I'd done a little bit before that, but it was at a moment when I was leaving a practice that I'd been working for 7 years and was setting up a baby practice with a friend. And in the way that one subsidizes baby practices, maybe by teaching, writing became the way that I was doing it. And I got a 3-day-a-week position as architecture critic for a weekly architecture magazine in England called Building Design. And in that capacity, for about 10 years, I was writing a review of a new building every week, maybe a 1,600-word review. And it became apparent to me quite quickly that I was a better writer than I was an architect, and a happier one, and a more plausible one. So yeah, my ambitions to be an architect in private practice kind of fell away, and writing increasingly became the focus of my career, mixed to an extent with curatorial work. And I haven't been writing architecture criticism really for 5 years. I've been doing the Architecture Foundation, and I've been writing a book, which I'm just finishing, which is a biography of an architect, which is a very different sort of writing from the kind that I'd done previously.
Thank you.
And now perhaps our guests on screen can tell us a little bit about their journey towards architectural writing. Maybe we can start with Manon.
Yeah, I'm happy to start. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm Manon Mollard. I'm the editor of the Architectural Review. It was never a kind of, maybe a dream job, but never a kind of direct aspiration to get here. I trained as an architect. I was always very intrigued, even at architecture school, by the kind of research and the background work that would go into the project, but also in using text and words to kind of develop ideas and build arguments and build an architectural project. This moment where you put all your drawings and models to the side and you just think, actually, what am I trying to say with this project? And you write it in a paragraph or a page. And I always enjoyed that. And so I joined the Architectural Review as an intern while I was doing my master's in London. So I spent 2 months with the team, which was at the time led by Catherine Slesser. And I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed getting to see and to know a kind of much more real side of architecture, getting to do lots of different things in a day versus the kind of slower pace of designing your own project as a student. And then little by little, I joined again on a kind of short-term basis. And then after I graduated, I gradually joined full-time. And I've now been at the AR 10 years, actually, this summer, and editor for 5 years now.
Thank you. And Emmanuel, you're next on the screen.
Hi, thanks for, apologies for being late. I am the editor of Pinup, and I also run another publication called November that I co-founded. And in terms of writing, I would have to say I don't know, it's like the cart before the horse. Like I really found like architectural theory before I really found writing, or I found like a critical framework and thinking that really led me to kind of, I think writing is where I do go to both resolve and produce new meaning. But yeah, it was in college that I kind of was like initially attracted to what I had learned was architectural theory, and I continued that sort of line of thinking in graduate school. But my particular project is to complicate what architecture can be. So it's not so one-to-one. It's more like a spatial thinking across mediums and kind of decoding how we can read both like varying systems and structures as architectures. And so that to me is where I kind of like live like architecture as like an interdisciplinary or intermediary and medium bridge between these varying practices. So if it's like, I think of writing as an architecture and inhibiting those kind of the spatial aspects of it. And yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you. And lastly, Alice.
Thanks for having all of us here this afternoon and morning, depending on where it finds you. I'm Alice. I am a co-founder of Deem Journal, a publication that thinks about design as social practice. And I basically found my way to design publishing actually through my personal practice. I am a research-based designer, and prior to that, or maybe kind of alongside my journey of that discovery in my life, I actually was working in marketing and cultural arts for about 10 years and really kind of wanting to leave that space and think about how to reappropriate the tools of kind of marketing, branding, design towards a lens that could kind of orient us towards how we're thinking about our present realities and also futures. So while I was actually starting a personal practice with my partner N.A.W called Room for Magic, we decided to collaborate with another design studio called Open Box, led by Marquise Stillwell, and we created Deem, publication that has now been kind of around for the past 4 years. And for us, it's really a space where we can take our research questions into practice, and also becomes a way of us organizing people around some of the ideas that we're thinking through. And also, I think just personally as somebody that was working with clients and trying to articulate and share ways of being and insights, it felt like there was maybe a lack of quote unquote print or tangible evidence for some of these things. So it's also kind of an evidence building tool for us as well.
Thank you all so much. I think it's really helpful to know how you guys all found yourself here. I think it's a helpful ground for a conversation. And so I'm gonna start asking everybody questions. And the first one is really about diversity in architectural writing. Thomas gave a very helpful introduction to the new Architectural Writers program. And I really liked when you said it's about new voices at different frequencies in architectural writing, and just the idea of giving room to underrepresented voices. And I think given that's how my cohort, that's why we're here, I'd like to hear from each of you about how you see the problem, if we agree that it's a problem, that there's a lack of diversity in architectural writing. And Alice, maybe it would be great to hear from you first, because Deem Journal is a publication that champions design as an inclusive and social practice. So.
Yeah, I can start. I saw this question, and I think it's a great question, I think, to start with. I think perhaps the question is also maybe when we're thinking about architectural writing, how are we defining that? I don't know that I necessarily always feel like there is a lack of diversity in architectural writing, so much as I think there's not many platforms that maybe have the resources to think about kind of architecture in its expanded sense. And so thus, if we find ourselves thinking about architecture through the lens of buildings or built structures exclusively, then I do think we have a representation problem when you think about who's studying, who's practicing, who's well-versed in that language. But I think when we're kind of expanding the frame for design and architecture as these quite kind of pluralistic practices, I don't necessarily feel like there's a lack of diverse thought, just maybe a lack of resourcing to make sure that we have enough spaces to cover those perspectives.
Alice, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I was very, the kind of writing I've done that my career has been based around is in a sense a very traditional definition of architecture writing. It's very object focused. As I say, I spent 10 years writing about a project every week, and a new project, and I still take that aspect of architecture writing very seriously, and I also feel it's not in particularly good shape. I mean, I was always very, what had particularly attracted me to architecture writing to begin with was the opportunity to come in and critique projects and write in a way that paralleled the kind of discussion that would happen in an office. What is the effect of the windows being 6 inches wider on the first floor? To be able to write with great precision about formal decisions. And a lot of the architecture writing that was project focused that existed when I began, I think, was quite secretarial, quite often being written by people who hadn't had a design training. And I think to write about a building critically is to redesign it in your head, what it could have been. And I think there was a value there, having had a background as a designer. As I say, not the greatest designer in the world, but I think there was a design skill there. That said, I've been excited to see this great sort of expansion in the territory of architecture writing, of what architecture writing is in the past 10 years, of which I think N.A.W. has been very central to that that expansion. I was very impressed by, I remember the first launch of After Parties for the first magazine. I think Farshid Musavi spoke at that event and was saying, for her, the inclusivity the importance of inclusivity for her, and she was speaking as a board member of N.A.W., was not about having a greater range of faces in the room, as it were, but about having a greater variety of ideas, a greater variety of topics. It was a mechanism for expanding the ways we talk about architecture, the way we look about architecture. So I think when we talk about inclusivity, we're talking about two things, aren't we? We're talking about the range of people who get access to the discourse, but also the range of ideas that they can bring to the discourse. And for me, it's always that latter, the latter aspect, which I agree with Farshid. That's ultimately the goal, that we're expanding the discourse through this through having more people contribute. So yeah, I'm keen that we have a discourse which is very serious about a focus on the objects of architecture, but also that we learn from this expanded field of discussion that we've benefited from in the last decade.
Thank you, and I think that's sort of important to note that like diversity on a demographic level and on the level of thought, those things have to happen at the same time and like they inform themselves. Manon or Emmanuel, do you have any thoughts about this?
I'm happy to go and respond as well to some of the points made by Alice and Ellis, because I agree that it's important to kind of broaden the definition and the realm of what architecture is, and I think the lack of resources are a problem probably for most architectural publications, independently of how established or old they might be, and perhaps this is something we can return to. And on your point, Ellis, about the kind of the object of architecture, I do agree that there's a kind of there's some definitely benefit in having trained or having built or having kind of a technical as well understanding of how a building kind of stands up, to be able to review it critically. And so in a way, the lack of diversity in architectural writing is also, to an extent, a question of a lack of diversity in architecture at large, for sure, which has a lot to do with architectural education, with, a lot of that comes into it, because it's, in order to diversify architectural writing and publishing, we need to kind of work further upstream and kind of go back to the beginning of what kind of training might be required. But yeah, it's also, I have to say, as the architectural review is 127 years old now, it feels like such an important task, and it also feels like it's going to take time to kind of deconstruct ways of doing that have been established for such a long time. So it's absolutely a kind of work in progress.
And then Emmanuel, if you have thoughts, I think you're the last person.
Yeah, I really think about specificity and the necessity for specificity in this context. And oftentimes when we talk about diversity, I think it lacks that like actual anchor. And it's not only, because I think in terms of the diversity of thought and thinking, I think so oftentimes like that burden is placed on those who are marginalized to both like advocate for their marginality, which I think doesn't necessarily provide a sort of resolve or actually space for a person to actually experiment. And I think oftentimes because of this lack and this like the lagging of the lack and the lack that continues to lack, it really creates like this perpetual disposition. And so I really like being a person who is over-identified, like I really made it a point to not write about my marginality or put that in the forefront, and to actually engage subjects that were of interest to me personally. And then I can't escape my marginality. I can't escape my identity despite the subjects that I engage. So it was really about grounding and gesturing at these different bridges between both like who I represent and how I process my interiority. So I think I'm interested in creating a context and a space to kind of continue to complicate what it means to be a brown practitioner in this space and not have it be so didactic, because this language is so reductive. So to be a Black practitioner is really about like representing in the kind of like literal sense, but not actually having to be representational in a more kind of formal thinking, where you can only talk about the subject matter that you're immediately implicated in, or it's just that you're assumed to be implicated in. So I think diversity in thought is like a little bit too vague for me. I'm like, I want to actually create tangible, like a very formal structure that people can inhabit, that doesn't limit them to only self-represent through the material that they write.
Thank you. So I suppose our next question also has to do with representation in architectural writing, but in the context of typically we see a writer from the global north traveling to the global south to review a building or to cover a story. And I suppose I'd like to direct this to Ellis, given your history with the Telegraph and given its global remit, and also potentially Manon, where you have building reviews that are done in the global south. What steps can be taken really to mitigate this as an issue?
I mean, yeah, I didn't do it very often, I have to say. You know, when I was a critic both for building design and, I was for a while the Daily Telegraph's architecture critic, both of which have a UK audience fundamentally, and I was probably, writing for the Telegraph before. Well, no, it was they did have a website then, but it's I guess it's maybe got more of an international following since the website's developed. But it would, their focus, I would say, was not only on British architecture, but almost home counties, southeast English architecture, because their readership was very southeast England, and the Telegraph sort of struggled to, they understood why you might write about an arts building, or it was rather hard to pitch them a school or a housing scheme. Why they would sit in there. So it wasn't often that I was in a situation where I was going to write about, say, a new museum in Qatar, or and when that happened, it was because there was a new institution that had a press budget, and that they were bringing journalists over for. So it was very partial. The things that we were able to even to afford to write about overseas. But I guess Manon is going to be able to offer a fuller answer because she edits a truly kind of global magazine, and obviously one which has a kind of relationship historically to the Commonwealth. The audience of the Architectural Review. I know it's always had readership in architecture schools around, particularly the Commonwealth, where schools that have been accredited by the RIBA, and so there's always been this impulse, at least since the war, the Second World War, I think, to represent work from those territories. I think Manon's probably going to be able to give a bit more of a productive answer than I can on that.
It's true. I mean, you don't have to go as far back as the war or the existence of the Commonwealth and those kind of different alliances between countries and relationships to notice that this remained true, I have to say, until very recently. Partly, I think, out of ease, perhaps, that the AR used to have a kind of regular roster of kind of contributors that would keep the editorial team, they would stay in touch with the editorial team and would say, I'm traveling here, I'm going to see this, are you interested in a review? And so it was a kind of natural way of kind of commissioning pieces in a way. There was this kind of relationships between the editors and the different writers, and that kind of gave shape to the content in a way. I think the kind of very first thing that can be done is obviously to commission more local writers, and I think this is important for many reasons. And this is something we've been endeavoring to do at the AR in more recent years. And I wanted to use an example, which was a piece we published in our Labour issue. It was a project in Akuse in Ghana, and it was reviewed by Yolanda de Silva. It was a fair trade, so it was called. And it's one thing to kind of commission a local writer who obviously will have, firstly, it'll be easier and more ecologically friendly for a local writer to visit a project. I think it's useful to repeat that we kind of visit all the buildings we publish, or the writer visits the buildings they write about. And so it makes a lot of sense ecologically as well, which I think is important too. They obviously have an understanding of the place, of the context. They're able to sometimes, speak the language of the client, the users, the architects, which might not be the case of a British or foreign critic who's kind of flying in. And in the exchanges that we had with Yolanda de Silva on this particular piece, it reminded me of a lot of kind of important aspects to consider when publishing projects that are in contexts that are less familiar to the editor, because we rely so much as editors, we're a small, relatively homogenous team based in London. And so we have to kind of trust, the writers and their takes and the information that they have. So, for example, the fact that, some of the information that is found online was kind of out of date or inaccurate. I think we're, learning not to trust Wikipedia, which sometimes has kind of mistakes. And, the kind of ever-increasing importance of kind of fact-checking, but also there are certain sensitivities that, again, we might not be aware of as editors who are kind of further away and who have very different backgrounds and lived experiences. And so in this particular example, I remember us talking to the writer about how we would call global mamas who had commissioned the project, and Arandi was, highlighted that it was important not to refer to global mamas as an NGO, because it could trigger negative associations with kind of white saviorism, and so it could also kind of potentially diminish a good project. So there's the landscape around kind of these issues is very complicated, and I think it's important to remember that the language and the words that we use actually play a very important role in navigating the nuances. So commissioning a local writer is not just to kind of redress the imbalance, or to kind of fix something that we feel wasn't always done perhaps properly. And I thought it was also worth mentioning on this point that sometimes as editors will also feel that it is actually very useful to commission someone who has a little bit of distance from a project, because they can bring a kind of different perspective to a place. And it has happened before when commissioning a piece, to notice that actually there's relationships between the people we commission who are writers, the architects, the clients. Sometimes, they might know each other. There might be relationships that we're unaware of as editors. In commissioning local writers, we have to work with so many more new writers, than you would if you were to rely on your regular roster of contributors. And so it is important because as editors, we have to ensure that the writers we commission can be critically independent. And so sometimes people are too close to a place, to a practice, and that's important to kind of be aware of as well. And so sometimes commissioning someone who isn't that familiar with the place and who might be traveling to see, to meet an architect or to see the work can also bring a refreshing kind of perspective to the work and discuss something or kind of make kind of comparisons with other projects done elsewhere. And so there sometimes is also value in that, which I felt was important to say too.
It's interesting that you mentioned kind of the sensitivity and the nuance that I guess is lacking when you don't have a local writer. And so that sort of feeds into my next question surrounding sort of more established publications like the AR, which often kind of have a sort of problematic past in terms of race, gender, class, dealing with issues like that. And so I wanted to ask you how publications like that have adapted to a more sort of contemporary audience, and how you've addressed issues like restitution while continuing sort of this long legacy, and what further work you think is necessary to sort of push that publication forward.
It's very true. And I think, again, as I said at the beginning, this, I think we're slowly, and I hope, we're kind of gradually taking steps in that direction, in the right direction, but it's, of course, there's still a lot of work to be done. I thought it would be useful to, something we've done recently that I could share with you was the issue we did in April, which was the 1500th issue of the AR, which was quite a daunting kind of issue to think about and to approach. And we decided to look back at our own archive because the archive is, of course, worth celebrating, but we felt it was so crucial to also critically reassess it and to analyze how ideas had evolved, what had been written that remained relevant, but also how much the world had changed since particular pieces had been written. And we chose the kind of unavoidable lens of the climate crisis. And so the idea was to commission authors to revisit pieces that had been published in the AR itself 20, 50, or 80 years ago. There were two that I thought I could mention to kind of illustrate what we were doing in that issue. So one was Thomas Berlanda, who looked back at a piece from the early 50s, and it was a piece called Grassroot. And so in it, he kind of denounced the deep flaws in the studies of, so-called primitive huts. I mean, we go back to the question of language, and which we'll return to, I think. But so he also highlighted in his piece the fact that these studies were also bringing to the fore the possibility of a more collective and ecological practice. He had this line which I thought was very important and relevant to today's discussion. Thomas wrote, "The delicate passage to a just and decolonized world cannot be separated from the environmental crisis that the legacy of empires has left us with." And so, although we chose obviously the filter of the climate crisis, we think of these issues of as kind of very intersectional, and so it was very important for us to kind of draw connections. And when looking back at a piece written in the 50s, it was written by Alan Houghton Broderick, to also kind of be critical of, as I was saying, of its own language, of how it was written. So as part of this issue, we kind of scanned the original pieces that the authors had revisited for the magazine and made them available to readers on our website. But we had to kind of caveat them, I guess. We reproduced them or, scanned them and kind of published them exactly as they had been written and published at the time. But so we have, this line on those online articles. It clearly says when the piece was published originally, etc. But we highlight the fact that the language of the piece reflects, the values and usage of the time in which it first appeared, because I don't think it's a question of kind of correcting them and rewriting them now. The idea is to kind of be aware of the archive, not to hide or kind of correct that history. But revisiting it is a really important, I think, step in kind of understanding what has been done, but also in acknowledging that the work that we're doing today and pieces that were commissioned last month will equally need to be, revisited and looked back upon. And so it was part of that issue to kind of try and shed light as well on the stories and geographies that had been excluded from the AR's history because of the choice of subjects, of geographies, but also of authors who had been commissioned. And so, for example, I'll be brief on this next example, but we commissioned Tanvi Jain, who's a young Indian architect and writer, currently based in the UK, actually. But she wrote, she looked back at the pieces written by William Gerard Curtis, who is obviously a very established critic and who contributed to the AR very regularly, and he had particularly written quite a lot about India, including an outrage in December 2020 about the dormitories of Ahmedabad's Indian Institute of Management by Louis Kahn when they were threatened of demolition. And it was really interesting to have Tanvi's take on this, because one of the things that she was saying to us, and she was arguing in the piece, is that although that outrage and that online petition written by Curtis had been really important in raising awareness about the demolition threat, it was also received with kind of certain aggressivity locally, and so it wasn't necessarily conducive to the most kind of constructive dialogue that actually required to kind of engage all parties. So this idea of kind of commissioning writers with, different relationships to some of these topics that have previously been given, I guess, or kind of by kind of more established critic, has been quite an interesting exercise. And of course, there's a lot to do, and we've been speaking so far about writing, but perhaps we can talk with Alice and with Emmanuel as well about the other aspects of the editorial process. I think it's not just who is kind of visible and whose byline there is, but who is involved in all the different parts of the editorial process, and whether visible or invisible, and making sure that at the AR we're trying to slowly make sure that we involve people with different backgrounds, experiences, perspectives in the different parts of our process.
Thank you so much. And that's helpful because we wanted to shift a bit. We've been discussing sort of content, and we want to talk about like the medium of the print magazine. And I think it might be helpful to hear Emmanuel's take, because, pinup, I used to intern at Pinup, and I know they do this thing with each issue where there's, in the physical magazine, they sort of do something funky. So I was working on the 29th issue, the Revolution issue, and instead of having a straight edge of the magazine, it was like a jagged edge, like a zigzag. And I think there was a copy with like concentric circles cut out in the magazine. And so I guess I want to hear some thoughts about the value of the physical object and the choice to like insist on that, given the economic pressures around a print magazine. So yeah, Emmanuel, would you like to start?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's funny, you actually started, that was, I believe that was Ben Gann's, our director's first issue, our director and designer, and the die cut has really, Felix's, and the priority of the magazine has like largely been to make the magazine an object and a collectible. And that has always kind of been the kind of driving factor for the magazine, to make it this like sculptural object. And like how I kind of inhabit this space is like I wanted to bring that kind of conceptual approach to the physical form, to the actual like literary approach, and how we kind of approach structuring content and enlisting like contributors, and also just like the general flow of the magazine. But in terms of, I was thinking while Manon was speaking about writing and standards, and the thing that I really do think about in terms of architecture, and like my reason largely in my resistance to the kind of the general weaponization of language, is that like sometimes it often feels like when we're in these like kinds of containers, we're only speaking to each other, and it's very kind of like inward facing, and it's not necessarily kind of like facing outward. And so in terms of like the way that we try to enlist architectural writers into kind of combat these different modalities of thinking, whether they are physically manifested within buildings or within books or within like physical gatherings, like it is the priority for me. And because I worked at art form prior, before grad school, and thinking about like the idea for us at Pinup is that we're trying to reach people through, like architecture is the vehicle, it's not the destination. And just in terms of how we want people to, vibe with the content. So it's like, if we were driving down a proverbial road, we want everybody to be able to see that this is a vehicle of architecture, and we are heading in a similar direction. And you can kind of like witness that journey, and like voyeurism, to be voyeuristic in a way. But I think it's about reaching the masses is really the priority. And I think a way to do that is to seduce people through the actual object. And I think Felix has been so, and the design team has been like so like gracious and both really like productively aggressive in terms of making this like very typically, the word that came to mind was dry, like subject and thinking sexy. Like I think it really has made architecture sexy and accessible, which is, I think, necessary in terms of, because we seduce people in, and then we like attack them with these very strong systems of thinking. But yeah.
Thank you. I think that's a really wonderful way of putting like Pinup's whole vibe, sexy and accessible. I think it's true. And Alice, it'd be great to hear your thoughts on this, given you chose to publish a print magazine in 2019.
Yes, would love to share. I think in terms of print as a vehicle, the physical object is really important for many reasons, but I think I'll also just try to kind of answer this from the standpoint of a design and research-based practitioner, through which basically publishing is maybe one expression, and the printed word really does feel increasingly important. And I think for a few things. One, because a lot of what we're interested in is thinking about how do we actually frame up and present design as a diverse, process-oriented practice. So as a designer, a lot of the ways in which we're thinking about working with the artifact is really thinking about kind of tools being the language and kind of words being these frames. For us to be able to kind of connect ideas and thoughts, and also kind of use it as a space to develop a bit of shared language around how we can bring some of these new realities to form. So really just thinking about kind of publishing and the physical kind of artifact as one, I think kind of like an artifact of a world building process, a site of experimentation, a way of kind of sharing a deep relationality that's kind of necessary for us to think about how do we come together and learn together as we try to kind of shape a different and or collective discourse of this time. And I guess in relationship to the object, I find it to be really important, especially knowing that we are moving towards a place that is becoming increasingly more digital, is that the designer Jenny Odell talks a lot about this like attention holding architecture, and it's really kind of being this moment for which we actually truly stop and kind of attune ourselves to listen quite differently. And I think that we're in a time where we're interfacing with so many technologies and medias that are vying for our attention. So I do think that that physical kind of object does become a space where we can actually start to hold our attention. And I think that with Deem, a lot of the media that we make is hyper slow. Couldn't be slower maybe sometimes. I think when you read it, or when you experience it, it's actually experienced that way. It's very long form. Everything is written. I mean, you can kind of maybe sense the time that it takes to, do this type of polyvocal work. It's also publishes once a year. So I think for us, it's really about, how do we bring attention to some of these ideas? How do we think about or kind of shape our perspectives and actually just attune ourselves to the ways in which design is showing up regularly? And then also, how do we actually just like train ourselves into a practice of paying attention? We're at a time where we really need to be paying attention. And so I think that publications can offer a space for listening.
Thank you. That feeds quite nicely into our next topic of conversation. You talk about kind of this move to the digital. There's a lot of new technology that's resurfacing, and something that's looming is kind of the concept of AI. And so Alice is someone who's spoken about that, but also worked across various different disciplines. I mean, music, the food business, and now publishing. I'd be intrigued to hear from you and the panel about how the rise of AI might affect architectural writing.
Great question. I'm not gonna lie, I personally haven't spent a lot of time thinking about how AI is going to impact my current or future world much, because I have many other things that I'm worrying about in the current moment. But I have given some thought to this question since you posed it, which is that I do believe that we can train a lot of robots to write and produce things for us at a scale that is likely incomprehensible to most of us sitting in this room. However, I do think that if we are thinking about how we are making these stories felt, there is a certain level of kind of lived experience that I think does come across any sort of writing that any one of the publications probably speaking here would be able to produce. And I'm not sure that that could actually be reproduced. And so I guess the idea is maybe with AI, if we're thinking about, quantity and turning around stories kind of consistently, then yes, that could possibly be a tool. But I think if we are thinking about the depth of the stories that we're trying to tell, I'm not sure that within the next 10 years that that a trained algorithm could make you feel that way. But I could be wrong, and I would be happy to revisit this conversation or this question in a couple of years.
Ellis, do you want to talk about this?
Well, I mean, I can certainly imagine there's a lot of the nature of journalism, architectural journalism, has kind of changed in a big way in the last decade. And when I was, at the risk of sounding like an old man bitter about what's changed, when I was editing Building Design, a weekly architecture magazine, and we had a staff of 10, and There were news journalists who would go out and have lunch with people and come back and write stories about what they'd been told over lunch. Or, you know, there were architecture critics who'd go out and encounter buildings and come back and write about you know, their views and their description, but also a kind of critique. And, you know, something like Dezeen is, to my mind, the absolute antithesis of that. It's a machine that is fed by press releases produced by PRs, and what passes as journalism in that context is reprocessing press releases and at the kind of the most rapid speed possible in order to generate clicks. And that's a process which I'm sure will be sped up still further by the development of AI. But it doesn't have anything to do with what I understand architectural journalism to be.
Ellis, I'd also like to ask you, actually, it's interesting you bring this up, because I think having been in Venice and having seen the Biennale, and also Emmanuel referring to sort of architecture as a vehicle, not the destination, I think we've seen that there's been a significant shift in architectural practice, with the boundaries of architecture, art, fashion, film, to name a few, becoming increasingly porous. And I wanted to ask what effect this has had on architectural writing, which is arguably a bit more sort of traditional in nature.
Well, I mean, as I said before, I mean, what I see as traditional architecture writing is writing about projects, probably, and, you know, situating them in the context of, I mean, when I was writing about reviewing buildings, there's kind of only two questions you really ask, and they're kind of complicated questions. One is, does it work? And the other is, you know, does it fulfill its obligations to the city? And, you know, of course, you can interpret those questions in quite wide ways, but it's a narrow set of, a narrow kind of way of approaching the problem, the question of how you, how the world is made, looking on a project by project focus in the way that, and, you know, you look at, suddenly, you know, look at what the AR is now, the Architectural Review is now, compared with what it was a decade ago. I think the very nature of the kind of articles that Manon's publishing, the mix of building-focused pieces and pieces of a more expansive, you know, perspective, reflects this change that you're talking about, and I think it's been very productive.
I actually wanted to talk to the AI. I think about this a lot. I mean, first, like, we engaged in the magazine specifically. Like, I've worked in film. I used to work anyway, but specifically, I think like it's lacking. I'm so like hyper focused on specificity today, but it's like it really like and to your point, Alice, about like thinking about problems that are here today. Like it quite literally like speeds up a lot of these problems that we've like failed to acknowledge. Like I think when we hear AI, it's like this new sexy term that like it's like unknowable in a way, but it's like it manifests quite physically in a lot of the built environment. I mean, I think it like largely stems from like a unionization. Like the first, like AI to me is almost synonymous with like labor. And so when you bring up AI, you're really talking about like a lack of union, like increased like work demands. Like it really is. I mean, to me, AI is like the internet. It's another manifestation of the actual internet as a search engine. Instead of engaging physical books in a library, you're able to like browse like records. So I think it's about like adopting the technology in a way that's productive, but it has failed to actually preserve any of the kind of like intimacies of doing this kind of, you know, work. I mean, we're seeing that specifically in Hollywood right now. Like they're like the SAG-AFTRA, like they're like the actors and the writers are now like in strike in tandem, and this hasn't happened since the 60s. And because architecture is largely like a non-union professionalization, like I think that's really the largest problem, and people aren't protected. And so, like, architecture has remained untouched largely because it hasn't followed suit with like traditional journalism infrastructures. So I think we're like grappling with like labor and how to kind of like create standards for payment, because these things haven't been formalized, they like have remained abstract. It's like we're journalists in name, but like not journalism in like union and protection and resources and standards of living.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm going to ask my last question, which is kind of on the opposite end of this AI discussion, hopefully a little bit more optimistic. And then afterwards, hopefully the audience can ask questions. But I'm interested in collaboration, and I think that's sort of the heart of the New Architecture Writers Program. And I'm interested to hear what your sort of various perspectives, what you think collaboration in architectural writing can look like, from like a traditional publication like the Architectural Review to, I think, younger publications that maybe, or I feel, or I think, might have more room for collaborative writing practices.
I'll go first. Collaboration is my favorite word. I love like baiting people in to then kind of help them formalize and structure their ideas. But in terms of how that kind of like manifests in the writing, like I think it is about giving people, like there are so many things we've done specifically in the magazine that I think have really revived it. Like we've introduced a keyword section, which is like this exercise in language. And so it's to basically give 3 people the same word or variations of the same word. And like it could be apple, and that incites a different meaning based on that person's relationship to the language, which is really productive for us. And then also for the book reviews, for the book section, like we have, like, rather than kind of being submissive to a press cycle and featuring books that are up for press, like that, we've imagined that as a section to engage old books that really resonate and were like defining and definitive moments in people's careers, to kind of like reflect on those in real time. So you have both practitioners who are being main stage currently in that we've created this tension between like either keywords with like language. There are these kind of like mini manifestos to like these book reviews, like people reviewing books from the 70s. And it's really just about like creating pockets of tension. And I often say, I almost forgot, but I often say that like readers make the magazine, editors make the writers, and writers like further like define and set the tone for what the magazine should be. And so it really is like this like ecosystem that's really, because like writers both are feeling their way through the magazine, and readers are like encountering that feeling, and then editors are just massaging and kind of like orchestrating the kind of body of thinking that's happening. So I love collaboration. I think really one word that's synonymous for me with collaboration is listening. I think you have to be an active listener to both kind of contextualize thinking both on the page and even in conversation in real time.
I mean, I think collaboration for me is synonymous with editing. You know, we're about to go into this live editing process, and if you write for a good editor, it's a dialogue, and they bringing ideas that you're wanting to respond to. I wrote something I've got a friend who edits a magazine called The Gentlewoman, which is a sort of fashion magazine, and she asked me to write something for her about mausoleums. And it was more money than I've ever been paid as a journalist. I think it was like £1.50 a word. And about 3 months later, I suddenly realized, Penny actually, she writes the entire magazine, you know, after we were on draft 5, and you know, she had an idea what this piece was going to be, and we were going to work it through together, and so it was that was quite an extraordinary experience of realizing she was a seriously good editor, and there was this was a very specific relationship that she was expecting. Of course, there are other kinds of, you know, so I think the question of what collaboration can be in this context is a question about, yeah, how you constitute the relationship between editor and writer, and, you know, like After Party obviously have a, you know, they kind of, I think they're effectively, you're all editors and you're all writers on the same title, and that's an interesting model.
I completely agree with that, Ellis, actually, that collaborating is editing. I think it's so important for us at the AR to have lots of back and forth with writers. And of course, this is where we go back to the question of resources, because we're completely aware that this isn't the same kind of demand in terms of time, you know, from the writer when you're working through 3 or 4 drafts rather than just submitting and you're done. But this idea of having as many eyes and hands on a Word document, you know, as possible when copies filed in. So even have several editors within the AR editorial team kind of look at a piece and feedback on it is so important. And I think it makes writers, us included, because, you know, the editors at the AR have also written and write more or less regularly for the magazine as well. And it has also helped us make us kind of less precious almost about our own words or our own kind of ideas. And I think this back and forth and this kind of, you know, tracking edits on a Word document is probably the most useful thing there is for us in the comments, and that process of back and forth, it does open up a kind of very vital conversation about intellectual labor, about, you know, who is, you know, if you're going to have more hands and more eyes on a piece. Sometimes we even commission an editor outside our team to kind of feedback on a piece because we feel they're better equipped to actually feedback on a particular topic or on a project in a particular place than we are. And so we're very mindful, you know, and very aware that so many editorial projects have kind of typically exploited that labor, that it's really important to kind of acknowledge that labor and compensate all contributors who are involved in the process. And a much more kind of direct way of collaborative writing, perhaps, that we do at the AR is the editorial, which is the kind of short text on the first page of the magazine that kind of introduces and frames the theme, is now co-authored. So it has, historically, it was always written by the editor and kind of signed with the editor's name. When I was appointed editor, I wrote the first few, and then I thought that actually it was important for the other editors in the team, you know, who are also commissioning and editing pieces, to in a way take responsibility and ownership for the kind of themes that we're discussing. And so we started, you know, co-authoring editorials. It's probably the shortest, it's definitely the shortest piece in the magazine, but it's arguably the one where a lot of time is spent, just because we kind of discuss it together, and then one person will start writing, one person will continue, and so it's this kind of exquisite corpse type of text that is then kind of edited and refined, and this has proved really productive as well, in terms of kind of owning to the editorial ideas and arguments that we want to put forward, but also in terms of kind of, yeah, learning from one another as editors. So the idea of collaboration is also applied to kind of our editorial practice as such. And there's only one thing I wanted to say from listening, something that I've heard, like this kind of separation almost between traditional architectural writing and other forms of architectural writings, or this kind of binary between established publications and perhaps newer, more recent publications. And I just wanted to say that I'm not sure it's that helpful, that I find it more productive to think about what there is in common between traditional architectural writing and what forms of architectural writing are emerging today, and what there is in common between more established publications and more recent ones. Because I think there's a lot more overlap and a lot more in common than differences actually between the two.
Thank you. Perhaps Alice can add one final point.
Yeah. One final point is actually, I'm just going to build off of your previous point about, actually, I mean, I think that all of the points around collaboration through an editorial process have been expressed. I don't have a lot more to add there, but I am very much interested in what it means to also think about kind of collaboration and these webs of relation between different publications that have been around for different periods of time. I'm very interested in what that could look like. I do think that perhaps some of, all of the things that have been expressed here and all of the ideas that a lot of us have around architectural and design writing, I think also ultimately always comes down to what the resources are that are at hand. So I'm always interested in what it could be to think about, kind of cross-media collaborations. I think that there's a lot of kind of fruitful space there. And I'm just interested in kind of being able to test and experiment with that more. So that's, I think, what I would add.
Great. Thank you so much, and thank you to all of our panelists online and to Ellis here with us in person. I think this has been a very productive conversation. I think it'll be interesting to see how what we've learned through Venice and this conversation feeds into the work of our cohort and cohorts to come. I think we might have, apparently we don't have time for audience participation, but maybe one or two questions. If anyone has a burning question, I can run over to them with the mic, or we've got someone here with the mic.
Seem to be no burning questions, so thank you so much. We can wrap it up. Yeah.
Thank you.
Very good, very good.
Yeah, the way it's going to work for the next couple of hours is we're going to run you through an exercise that we often do in the program called live editing. Oftentimes it's quite a nerve-wracking first experience for the members to kind of see their work exposed. But it's also a process in which to become comfortable and almost vulnerable with our words and with sharing. And so it becomes a really a peer-to-peer process. This demonstration will be, we'll try to run through 3 separate texts of 3 of the members who've been writing in these last days, as mentioned earlier, as part of their residency here. Each of them tasked with reviewing a piece of the Biennale. And first up, we have Lila and Fayal. Lila's going to introduce what she's interested in. So which bit of the Biennale she's wanting to review and write about. And is going to read the first paragraph of that text. And then Fayal's going to help Tom try and edit this piece. And hopefully there'll be a back and forth, a bit like how it was described earlier in the panel discussion as editing as a place of collaboration. We might open it up to the audience later, so it could be like a kind of editing frenzy, but let's see. So if you take the mic, you just initially talk us through this particular decision you made around why you wanted to choose the Canadian Pavilion, and then maybe when you're ready to read the paragraph.
Yeah, sure. Hi, I'm Lila. I'm a student at the Architectural Association, and I am from Canada, so I think it was sort of something I was already quite interested in, was looking at what was the Canadian Pavilion up to. And I think I was really struck by this pavilion, which was curated by Architects Against Housing Alienation, which is kind of a grassroots movement advocating for housing access and land rights. And I really liked the way that they tied together kind of these fundamental questions about decolonization and Indigenous justice with housing. So should I go ahead and read maybe the first? Okay, so I'll just read the first paragraph that I've started. Right. At first glance, you might wonder if there's a protest happening in the Venice Biennale, and there is of sorts, albeit in an extremely well-mannered way. In a corner of the Giardini Park, under the shadow of the British Pavilion. Signs reading "Land Back," "No Surrender," and "Airbnb kills cities" sit by a fence with imagery of encampments. This is not for sale. The work of activist collective Architects Against Housing Alienation, AHA, based in so-called Canada. The exhibition presents their 10 demands, addressing issues of affordable housing, gentrification, and land rights, rooted in their statement that we believe that the root of the housing crisis lie in the capitalist and colonialist dispossession of people from their land and homes.
Thank you for reading this for us, Leela, and thank you for introducing this section. I think this is an incredibly strong opening, which works in two ways. It does the classic, we have the pyramid of news. You know, we know exactly what we're going to be reading about in the first paragraph, but it also draws us in with this slightly, the opening sentence raises questions in the reader. What is going on here? Is there a protest happening in the Venice Biennale? So you draw us into your subject really well. I wonder if, Ferial, if you have any comments about this.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with it, but also I think what works really well is that you're already sort of hinting at this sort of discomfort of trying to stage a protest within the Biennale and the sort of well-mannered way in which it's done, and sort of how can you actually be radical or push back against such an institution from within its walls. And I think you hint at it really subtly, and I think that worked really well.
Do you have any suggestions about the first paragraph?
I would say my one thing would have been maybe in using the term Canada. I know you prefaced it by saying so-called Canada, but I think something that could potentially be powerful is just actually saying, okay, rather than Canada, we will be using a sort of more decolonial term, and this is what I now acknowledge this land mass to be called. So I think just to put us in that sort of framework for thinking about how to rethink the entire territory, that could potentially be powerful, but maybe also confuse the reader, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think because later on I used the kind of method that AHA used, which is like to put these slashes, and it's all kind of lowercase. And I think, so maybe it's about using that initially, like right at the beginning, to kind of introduce like the way that they approached, the way that they wrote Canada kind of signals like these ideas of enclosure and dispossession, so kind of challenging the idea of the nation state.
I suppose one of my suggestions, or questions rather, about this first paragraph is if this information in the final sentence maybe belongs a little bit further down in the piece, because we're getting into the real detail of their exhibit here. And one thing that is missing, we hear about the British Pavilion, but we're not being explicitly told that we're in the so-called Canadian Pavilion. But that is, I think that could be very easily remedied by adding it here. Something like, I need to turn on editing. I'm not the world's fastest typist, so yeah, this is slow editing as well as live editing.
This is also quite a slow process, yeah? But the idea is there's a kind of an iterative process. So much like if you want design in a building where you go through multiple iterations, I suppose this is a kind of an example of how maybe we might approach the redrafting and drafting and redrafting of a text as well.
I suppose I would also, actually, like going back to that question, and this is where you see how nitpicky the editorial process can be. So I've worked at the Architectural Review for 1 year longer than Manon, who we saw earlier, I would add. I've been party to these conversations in the press room on press day when you're reading pieces that come in, and there's a lot of back and forth. And I suppose one of the things we try to demonstrate with these live editing sessions is that there is not really one right way to edit a piece, and there's not really one right way to write a piece, to express a thought. The editorial process is usually a conversation between the editors and the author as well. And there can often be disagreement, sometimes quite lively disagreements amongst
Layla,
editors.
disagree.
Well, you can disagree with me if you want, but what I was going to say is that I don't know if we need to know that we're under the shadow of the British Pavilion. That feels to me a little bit like, I don't know, it kind of sets the scene a little bit, but I think that the information that we're in the Canadian Pavilion has a higher priority in terms of the information that you're giving to your audience, but feel free to push back on that.
I think I kind of wanted to put in some colonial overtone of like setting up the stage of Canada as a Commonwealth country being sort of shadowed by this motherland of England, and it's quite explicit in the way that the British Pavilion is on the top of the hill, and then Canada's sort of like pushed behind. It's very literally like it's little minion looking up at it. So.
Okay, I like that point. I think that's a really good point. So what I would say is, could you draw that point out a little bit? Maybe not in the first paragraph, where it might get in the way a little bit of conveying the immediate information about the pavilion to the reader, but I do think that that could come later down, and I think it's actually a really good way of, it's great to tell the readers who, it's readers of Wallpaper magazine, this is who we've suggested is the readers of these pieces, who may not come to the Biennale, who may not have been to the Giardini, who may not know what the setup is like. So I think that is important information, but maybe could come a bit lower down.
Yeah, I was just going to add, is there a way maybe of qualifying more your description of that entrance that you get of the pavilion on its own? Because I just feel that sit by a fence, the signs sit by a fence with imagery of encampments, it's quite a powerful statement that they made. They literally, the fence covers up the name of the pavilion, and you sort of have to wind your way through, and it's a bit disorientating. So maybe, you don't want to develop maybe too much in the first paragraph, but maybe just have one or two qualifiers that can sort of give a sense of how you're being received. Yeah,
I quite like that, because someone else in the cohort was saying that they hadn't gone into the Canadian Pavilion because they thought they weren't allowed to, because it doesn't really seem welcoming necessarily, which is kind of the point as well. So yeah, I think it's a good point.
It's interesting.
So we could use this material that I separated off from the first paragraph to make a second paragraph, maybe, where you talk a little bit more about what's in the exhibition. This could almost be a paragraph, because we're talking about an article in a magazine like Wallpaper, where the paragraphs will be quite short. So it doesn't have to be like an academic paragraph that goes on forever. So that could work as a standalone paragraph. But what do you think about having that information there? Does that interrupt the flow?
No, I think that's a good idea. And I think maybe something I didn't do that much, and I think I'm already over the word count as well. I didn't actually explain the 10 demands, I didn't really explain the layout of the exhibition. I'm not sure if that's something I should try to do more, or maybe that would come a bit later because it's more detailed. But.
And this is the challenge. It's a 700-word piece. It has to be brief. You do have to try and convey to your audience what's in the exhibition, but you also have to expand on them, the wider themes. So yeah, this is the challenge of writing to a short word count. So we could reinsert this this idea here, maybe. And you could say something like the staid, neoclassical. Am I overdoing it?
No, that's good.
Overbearing? Or is that too much? Let's try it out and see how it feels.
Or maybe just neoclassical, because I think neoclassical kind of goes with overbearing a lot of the time.
And that sets up a nice contrast as well between the neoclassical and the noisiness, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that is a bit of a, gives a bit of a false impression of the editorial process from this exercise is that we're reading it paragraph by paragraph. But of course, in the editorial office, you would read the whole piece through first, and then you would make some judgments about the themes, the structure. So this is a slightly odd way of editing, but it's by necessity. Any thoughts on this one, Ferial, on this?
Well, I was going to say, where could one introduce then a more like physical description of the pavilion? Because I love the word noisiness. I think it's a really nice way of getting us out of just the visual realm and introducing another dimension, which is so true because when you walk in, you literally have the footsteps of the people on top over you, and it's a very dynamic space. But then you go into sort of the work that they're doing. So I just feel that there wasn't any space really to sort of describe that experience of actually being in that space with all of this activity going on, which is so different from all of the other pavilions, which are sort of just exhibition space, and you hear people's footsteps. So I don't know, would it go here, or would it go maybe in the short paragraph right on top, where we're already sort of starting to explain what's going on in there?
Yeah, it could maybe go either. I think later on I continue to talk about things that are going on in there, so maybe that would be a good place to add about more physically. And also just a shout out to the people from the Canadian UBC students who are working in the Canadian Pavilion doing their studio there, and actually I learned a lot from them, and I would welcome any comments that they have on the text if I have left anything out, or because they know much more than me. So thanks for coming.
So you could add some more detail about the contents in that paragraph, which would then raise some questions about the priorities you have in describing what's going on in this pavilion. Mm-hmm. But since we're going to leave that, we can forget about that for the moment. But in this paragraph, as Ferial says, there's this really nice sense of being there, which is conjured by expressing different senses, the sounds in this case, the noisiness, the busyness, and the different participants. And the fact that this is a work in progress. And I like that you return to Great Britain as a contrast. It's not just a neighbour, but it's a contrast in terms of the curation and the contents. And you're speaking in a sort of quite a confident critical voice here about a pavilion that has generally been quite widely praised. So that's always great, you know, to introduce a new note to a conversation. I think that's great.
Yeah, I mean, I do really like their pavilion as well. It's not, I think the work is beautiful, but I did find like it almost felt like you're going into the Biennale or something. Like it's a very polished exhibition with like, do not touch the artwork signs everywhere. And that felt like the total opposite of what was going on next door, where it was like Post-it notes everywhere and just A4s that had been printed out on the walls. And it just felt much more like, as a visitor, you're also part of the exhibition rather than just an observer, which I appreciated, although I think there's kind of room for both. But yeah, I wanted to make the contrast clear.
I suppose one thing I would ask here is, as reviewers, we're often trying to understand not just how we experience things, but how a wider audience might experience things. And we often end up being ventriloquists who are speaking for an audience, and sometimes we have to imagine them. That's just the way it is. But I suppose one question I would ask, and I must admit I haven't made it to the Canadian Pavilion yet, so I rely on your judgment. Would it be clear to an audience what is going on here? Is that a potential issue raised by having a messy, incomplete process, which may be a virtue in some other ways?
Oh, like, is the exhibition design clear, is what you're saying?
Is it easy, do you think, for a visitor to understand what's going on, why it's messy and incomplete?
I think it really is. I mean, it's not that it's incomplete, like there is a complete exhibition, and I think it's very clear the way it's been. So it's essentially centering around their 10 demands, and it's very obvious, like the way that it's laid out with what the demands are, and then examples. But I think it's more about this collaboration with the students occupying the space and continuing to build on these demands. That's more how it's a work in progress, even though there is like a fully complete exhibition there as well, which I think is quite legible, although it is quite dense as well. There's a lot to engage with.
So maybe that would actually be, yeah, I'm wondering if this could move down a little bit after the messiness, to say that the messiness is structured around these 10 demands, which you do mention there. Maybe that would be a time to go into more detail on them. Freyal, do you have any comments on this one?
I was just going to say, I get the impression that there are almost two ideas in this paragraph, one of which you actually tease out further in the paragraph afterwards. So when you're speaking about unlike neighboring pavilions, this one is a work in progress, but then that idea is actually part of the paragraph that comes afterwards, where you're speaking about this messiness and the sort of studio upstairs. So maybe for the sake of just word count and trying to come under that limit, there are some parts of this paragraph that could be cut out because you sort of come back to that idea. Yeah, that sentence in particular, I don't know how relevant it is here. And it doesn't, the mute political voice doesn't really, that idea doesn't stem from the sentence before. But you might disagree, I'm not sure.
No, I think that's a good point. Maybe, yeah, kind of consolidating the top and the one after, yeah.
So could it be, you could say something like this, and I can't type.
But so can you see that making visible the editorial process actually in a way doesn't make it something that is somehow unknown, but actually it's something that you can understand, and so therefore you can also put yourself in the shoes of the editor, which I think is quite a useful thing. Is everyone still with us? Everyone's good?
So by moving this down here, this is fairly radical surgery, but you've now got a thought that naturally led to this quite powerful statement from the curators, which is a strong political statement, and that now leads on to the beginning of the next paragraph. So it could work like that. I'm wondering, Thomas, do you think have we come to the end of this first?
Yeah, I just think maybe this one here about maybe there's something around, if you could explore it, perhaps, Tom, the short sentence followed by a slightly longer sentence. How do you think that plays out as a kind of tone?
Why is that? Sorry?
Just where it says it refuses to mute its political voice.
Oh, right. I mean, I think we've got quite a long sentence here.
Yeah.
And then we've got a really, a concise sentence, and, variety is the spice of life. And that kind of, that variety in sentence length is quite a basic way of creating and prolonging interest in a piece. And particularly as the first sentence of a paragraph, having a short sentence is quite strong.
You don't think the mess is structured clearly? It's too long, actually? It could be two parts?
Yeah. I mean, that now probably is grammatically incorrect. So, the editorial process sometimes introduces errors as well as helping. I mean, I must admit that I have done that in the past, introduced errors of fact. So, to be a responsible editor requires more careful work than you can really do in half an hour. But thank you both very much for being the first on stage and for sharing your work with the audience. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your feedback.
Thank you. Next, we have Maya, and joined by N.A., and the two of you. So we're going to look at Maya's words, and N.A. is going to be the sharp critic. Okay.
Hi, I'm Maya, and I am working as an architectural assistant, and I chose to focus my exhibition review on the Dar Pavilion in the Arsenale, personally because I have an interest in architectural conservation and its politics, and I appreciated how it kind of proposed a forum as a form of architecture that responds to the challenges of a very complex site.
Thank you. Could you read the first paragraph for us, please?
Yeah,
and
sure. It's midway through the kilometre-long corduroy building in the depths of the Arsenale of the Venice Biennale that you are met with a space to rest. Here, individuals and groups come and go. A mother with a pram perches on the coral painted plinths for a moment. These 400mm high plinths are the reproduction of a colonial fascist facade in Sicily, broken into 15 modules that are part of the work of Palestine-based collective Dar, Sandy Halal and Alessandro Petti.
Thank you. It is really nice, and again, it does something that Leela's piece similarly did, and something that we try and encourage our members to do, which is to open the piece with a strong, evocative conjuration of the place that you are in, so that you're reporting to the readers, you're giving them a feel for the space, but you're also fulfilling those requirements of who, what, where, when, and how, more or less.
And what's really nice about this one is it offers up a kind of, Emmanuel spoke about specificity, and what Maya does here so well is, there's a real sense of scale and distance. So we read the kilometre-long building, we then know that these plinths are just so high. I think that's quite a nice play, actually. But Tom, maybe actually, N.A., what do you think, and where do you want to start on an editorial process?
I think it's good. I like how you set the scene. Like you can, I think like if you close your eyes, you can actually envision the space. So I feel like that's like a really good technique to introduce. Yeah, I have no other comments apart from that.
I mean, this is a tricky one to make holes in, and my holes would be really tiny holes. For this one, just things like, I mean, I really like that you're telling us it's a kilometre long. It's a hyphenated adjectival construction. And I really like this first sentence because it feels like a long sentence, and then you come to the end of it, and then you've got the space to rest. So it almost has a poetic quality, I think, which is very successful. And then here, individuals and groups come and go. It's very evocative. Again, this is a hyphenated adjectival construction. I just like saying that. I'm not an architect, so I don't think of things in terms of hundreds of millimeters. In fact, I'm probably spatially dyslexic or something, because I'm like, what is that? I don't know. Is that 40 centimeters?
I think I need to actually check whether it's that high, but I was trying to reference just it being typical seat height.
Right.
Which I could say instead, maybe.
I think I think what Thomas said is right, that the specificity is very powerful as a way of evoking a space, and the height of the plinth is important. Maybe it would also be useful to, another way of talking about it could be to talk about the amount of floor space they take up. Because I think that is quite an imposing part of it. They're sort of imposing not because they tower over you, but because they take up quite a lot of space.
Yeah.
Do you want to add that in?
Yeah. That would be useful.
So just to kind of remind ourselves, these are 700-word pieces with an intended target audience of Wallpaper magazine. Therefore, someone who's interested in design or has a wide interest in design, but might not necessarily be that familiar with the Venice Architectural Biennale. Yeah? So we're trying to help the reader along and to also understand the context a bit more, and to also be highly accessible with the words and language that we're using. Oh, I thought you were going to edit. I thought you were editing at the same time.
No. I'm just going to cut this because I'm not sure. I feel like part of just sort of gets in the way of that idea. Yeah.
So why don't you make the millimeter centimeters? That might be more if it is for a more accessible audience.
I honestly don't know. Is it 40 centimeters? Yeah. So the next paragraph.
And do you not think actually though, where it says Palestinian-based or Palestine-based collective Dar, that it almost seems like there's three people, but Sandy and Alessandro are actually part of the collective. So wouldn't you say like spearheaded by?
Okay.
I only wrote that because that's kind of what they're, how they're kind of labelled in the exhibition. So I was just, I mean, it could go either way, but just referencing.
No, I think let's go for it. Led by.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, maybe if they're a collective, they don't want to be led by, but, you know, that's kind of the founded by.
Founded by.
Founded by. Thank you. This is, useful.
Keep throwing ideas. This is good. This is good. More words from the audience.
So the next paragraph, we really zoom out from the specific to the wider themes of the Biennale, which is great, to tie the exhibition or to tie the exhibit to the bigger themes. And you tell a reader what they need to know, who the curator is, what they're up to, which edition of the Biennale it is. There's a lot of important information here. 45 centimeters. Thank you so much.
Okay.
This is, I mean, if only we could write every article with so many authors.
Stockholm and Palestine.
Mm-hmm.
Or could you say based between? Maybe. Also, to come back to that earlier point around a mother with a planned purchase on the coral-painted plinths for a moment. Do we think that needs another thing, or just we happy with that?
I like it.
You like that?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
It's got some nice alliteration in it, but not too much, which is really difficult to achieve.
Okay.
I do have a question about this next paragraph, though, because there's some... Now, I'm not saying this because I disagree with these statements, but there is some editorializing here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And what that means is that you're inserting your own opinions into the piece. Now, when we're writers, we're always inserting our own opinions into pieces. What we leave out, who we interview, the subjects we choose to write about, they're all informed by our own opinions. But we have to try and convey to the reader a sense of objectivity that is persuasive. Mm-hmm. So what I think you could do, well, I wonder if you have any suggestions about how you could step back a little bit as an author here, and instead of stating your own opinion as a matter of fact, which I do agree with as a matter of fact, but how could you frame this slightly differently?
The violence of colonization could be understood as the silencing.
So that's one way of doing it, and it's a classic method. Sometimes it can be a bit hedging.
Yeah.
And there is actually a way of making this strong kind of statement where you don't have to hedge. Mm-hmm. You just use someone else's voice. So I think this would be a really useful place to have a quotation from Leslie.
Okay.
Or perhaps from the curators of this section.
Just to look at this paragraph on its own, could you not take the last sentence, in pursuit of restitution, and bring that at the top? I don't know, just because in a way, the collective of Da is then challenging the kind of single voice. Mm-hmm. Now, would that be a nice follow-on? And then it would then mean that you kind of have a flow from the first introduction of Da and the project, and then get into these wider themes without such a jump.
I do think that you've made a point here, which there is a bit of a jump between these paragraphs. Maybe we zoom too suddenly from the specific to the broader themes of the biennial.
Yeah, that's valid.
So yeah, maybe, does that mean that the paragraph comes later, or is it a case of kind of pulling something in front? What do you think? Toby agrees. Toby, what would you do, Toby?
Yeah.
Okay. And then, N.A., what would you do to make that first paragraph flow better? How would you re-edit that? And Maya, this is not a butchering. This is just a repackaging.
It's very useful.
Just like moving the bit when it says in pursuit of restoration, moving that upwards, and then
Do you feel the introduction of In Pursuit of Restitutions a little bit too early? There's nothing else that's kind of...
I do a little bit.
So what could you, how would you almost make this sentence a little bit?
Mic.
Your mic?
Microphone.
Oh. Do you want to pass?
Thank you.
I mean, I would just like rearrange it and then maybe say just like the architect can no longer be seen as a single all-powerful entity with a single voice.
Yeah.
And then explain why that is, then maybe link that to pursue restoration. I don't know if that makes sense, does it?
Or could you say something like, could you kind of do something where you sort of say, this is an example, or da become an example, or da offer up an example?
Yeah.
And then what do you think? Or this collective mode of practice? ...
Makes apparent or something. I don't know.
My own feeling is that, so we've had a mention of colonial histories in that first paragraph already. So I think there is a way potentially of linking those ideas more directly than with this sentence. Which I haven't had time to think about, frankly, but let me see. Well,
whilst Tom is conceptualizing this sentence, what is the audience at the moment getting from this exercise? Admittedly, we do this in a much smaller group, and it's a little bit more kind of there's an atmosphere of intimacy rather than this quite palatial setting. What are you getting? Dominic? I'm sorry to pick on you.
No, it's all right. I mean, just initially how difficult of a process it is, or how like kind of incisive you have to be about the writer, the editor, and also bearing in mind that, you know, this is Maya's voice, like making sure that that stays within the piece that's being written. They're my initial thoughts for now.
I think that's great. I think incision is such an important term here, and I think incision and precision.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, for sure.
And I think it's a really good point, which is Tom's trying very carefully here to make sure that the words he's adding or interjecting remain in the voice of Maya. Yeah.
It's proving not messy, but it's you have to kind of grapple with a lot when you're editing, especially in front of an audience. It's very interesting to observe.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah.
Anyone else? Zachariah, don't make me pick on you. No, okay. Leila, what do you think of this process so far?
I mean, to be honest, I found it quite intimidating to be up on the stage. But, I mean, it was helpful. But it does feel like quite a performance, too. So, I don't know. I'm just not very comfortable in these settings in general, so I think it was a bit scary for me, but, yeah.
that didn't come across.
Oh, thank you.
So in the meantime, I've made issues for myself, and this is something that often comes up when you're editing as well. You try and insert something somewhere, and then the architecture starts to crumble elsewhere, and things stop, and then you end up making quite a lot of changes. That can be the case, and I would send, if this was a real editorial process. I would hope that you would be much more involved in this what I'm doing to your text. Yeah. So sorry for being a bit going a bit free range there. But in order to join this paragraph or this sentence to the preceding thoughts, I've focused on colonization, and I've inserted decarbonization a little lower down. Yeah. Because I think you're going to focus on decolonization in this piece, is that right? So I think that kind of, we can get away with doing that.
We have, Samir had a hand up. I don't know if you want to chime in.
Hello, hi, great, thank you, Thomas. Yeah, just in response to Thomas's question about what we're finding or thinking about this process, I think it's incredibly rigorous, it's incredibly seemingly empowering, and that process of reduction, refinement, accuracy, I think is quite an inspiring thing to watch, you know, unfold on the screen. So thank you. But just to point to a particular moment a few minutes ago, which for me was really poignant. It's when this question, the violence of colonization, was in the second paragraph, was pointed out, and then the question of whether Maya should be offering such an aggressive opinion, not aggressive, but an explicit positioning on whether colonization is violent or not. And I completely understand the tactic of using another person's voice or perhaps some self-distancing in the way the sentence is constructed. But I wonder whether or not we've now accepted in society, in discourse, have we arrived at that point where we now assume that the violence of colonization is self-evident? And if so, should we shy away from asserting it in text? That was it. But so, really interesting and I think poignant moment for me.
Thank you for raising that, because I must say that as I was doing that, I did feel a degree of discomfort, particularly as a white man telling a woman of color not to express these opinions. And I think that there is a structural problem within journalism that we and I, as you just saw there, perpetuate this idea that the journalist can't speak their opinions freely in the context of certain forms of writing. If it was an opinion piece, it would be quite different, I think. And perhaps I'm being overcautious as well. I know I've been told off for editorializing before, for inserting my opinions. Maybe I'm just perpetuating a kind of circle of violence there.
I completely agree with the sensitivity there, but you know, just to draw a parallel with climate justice, one can make really clear statements about the scientific fact of climate injustice. So the only question, and I haven't fully resolved it in my mind, but I'm just saying, I'm just wondering whether the parallel is true in our understanding of colonization, which means that it would move from opinion to historical and social fact.
Okay, so yeah, we're really getting into the nitty-gritty here, and I think maybe if I was going to pass this a bit more, I would not say, I think you could talk about the violence of colonization. I think maybe it's asserting that the violence of colonization is the silencing of certain voices and cultures, is maybe the statement as a whole either requires some unpicking or some justification, some demonstration, and one way of doing that would be by relying on a quotation, so that you don't have to justify yourself. You've got someone else to say it for you, then it's their problem. So in a way, it's also a bit of a space and time-saving technique to do that. And it's kind of what we do with academic writers as well. You know, we take people's quotations so we don't have to go and do all of the work of justifying our ideas.
So Maya, if you were to unpack this, or kind of, as Tom has framed here, offer up some kind of demonstration, what would you maybe add now to this, and perhaps therefore, you know, allowing yourself to keep it, or to make it even more explicit if you were to work with this. And N.A., if you want to also come in as well.
I think a quotation is useful, and there's also something about when I was writing it, it felt like a oversimplification of what is a massive topic. And yes, silencing is one part of it, but it's just, yeah, I was using it to kind of try to thread a motif of voicing and silencing throughout, but yeah, it just needs a bit of like rethinking, I think.
Could I make one suggestion that
Yeah.
might sort of go some way to resolving this question? You could say the violence of colonization is not just physical.
Yeah.
Not just.
Whatever that is.
It's not just.
That's not a word, sorry.
Not just.
Oh, thank you. It's not just physical.
Yeah.
I think by slightly modifying that statement, it becomes more persuasive.
Mm-hmm.
N.A., what do you think?
I think adding a quotation might be useful, like it might, I don't know, make the argument more convincing and like more, how do I say, like more empathetic in a way. But I'm not sure what quotation you could use. Are there like any quotations that were highlighted in the piece? Maybe quotations from people that might have like used the installation? Maybe, I don't know.
In this case, who do you think would be a good person to quote? Who do you think would be a good person to quote?
Maybe someone, because I briefly read it, maybe someone that's actually interacted with the installation. You could bring that up and see if they feel the same way about what you were trying to say. Does that make sense? Yeah.
So do we think, in that case, maybe it's a passerby or it's an exhibition visitor, or do we think there's more credibility if it's someone seemingly more, not significant, but more, has more cachet, whether that's perhaps Leslie herself or the architects, Sandy or Alessandro. What do we think? And actually, I don't know if that's something that maybe you as the author can decide. Actually, whose voice do you want to foreground?
Yeah.
What do you think, Maya?
It might take some research, but I guess either the architect or Leslie might be useful just so as it is so early, and maybe if there was space for a passerby, maybe a bit further down in the text.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So you've had the microphone for a long time. You've had a microphone for a long time.
No, I wanted to make a comment about, I think, the essays so far. I was happy with the entrance hooks for both essays so far. I think they were well written, and they actually give an idea about what the essay was about or what you're supposed to expect. It kind of like hooks you to read the upcoming paragraphs. And I felt this exercise is very interesting because I actually write a bit, and I've actually been through this process, but not in a physical setting like this. It's always been an online thing. And I think this, sometimes when I'm going through that exercise, it's a bit like, teaching me about how the audience is receiving my writing. So like, even I'm thinking in this particular way, how is someone also perceiving what I'm writing? So I think me sitting back here and listening and watching to all this, it helps me to understand that I may have a point of view or a way I want to express my writing, but it might be received in a different way by those who are reading my work. So I believe this process is a way to understand both points of views and how to actually write the work to make it clear to both the writer and then the readers. So, yeah.
Thank you. Do we have time? Do we continue the next bit, or what do we do?
We sort of, I think we've come to the end of our time for this one, but thank you.
Sorry, yes.
The Anglo-Saxon press, I'm the head of press at la Biennale di Venezia, so my question is to you as a writer, as a future journalist, why you, the Anglo-Saxon press, insist to write Venice Biennale and not La Biennale di Venezia, that is the right name, no? It's, for example, in the Italian press releases, we do not write, for example, the V&A, the Victoria and Albert Museum. We do not translate the name of the V&A in il Museo di Vittoria e Alberto, no? And during this year, I'm processing all the press releases from the national participations, amending the official wording, no? And year by year, all the national participation is they starting to write exactly, the name of in the headline, and so I would like to start to you as future writers to start, yes, to do not translate the name of the institution, writings in the headline and your text in La Biennale di Venezia and not the Venice Biennale. Or in the second sentence, there is the 18th International Venice Architecture Biennale, that is the 18th International Architecture Exhibition of La Biennale di Venezia, or Space La Biennale di Venezia. But in any case, I'd like to ask you if this is possible, or if it sounds strange to you.
Thank you for this question, which I think is an interesting one about different conventions of naming things in different cultures. And I think, generally speaking, we would try to use the correct terminology for events. However, I'm sorry, this is going to disappoint you, but I think if I filed something that had the official title, it would be changed by my editor. And it's because it's about communicability. It's about being understandable to the audience. And I don't think British people are unusually stupid, but we're just so used to calling Venezia Venice that for a start, for clarity, the word, I think Venice would probably have to be in there. And then you'd have a repetition of Venezia and Venice. I don't know. And then the name would be longer and longer. So one of the things that I think is maybe a little different, but you could correct me, about Anglo journalism is it tends to contract things to make them as brief as possible. So maybe that's just an excuse. I'm trying to cover up for our slightly a blinkered view of the world. And once we've started calling something, we're not going to stop.
Yes, I would like to be helped to correct this if it is a correction, but it could be a good start.
I understand the frustration. Yes.
But I understand the editorial rules yeah. But
I suppose a comparable case, and this is digressing a bit, but is that Turkey is now preferring to be called Turkey, if I pronounce that right.
Yeah.
And it does sometimes happen. It happens at the UN, I've noticed, but whether it will ever happen in the British press, I don't know. And again with the Ukraine, this was a big thing as well. It used to always be referred to as the Ukraine.
Yeah.
But then because of the war, it's now been referred to more often as Ukraine. So change is possible. I suppose that would be the optimistic thing to take from that. Thank you.
Can I just do one thing though, because Maya and I just discussed your text yesterday. We did it actually at the very pavilion, which I thought was sort of appropriate given its ambition to be a convener. And with just 700 words, you have to kind of carry one thread. And that's kind of one idea that other ideas can kind of sit alongside it. But really it's this kind of clarity of one key idea. What did you, in the end, want to express through your text? I mean, I think I have a sense of it, but what did you, because in the end we had 44 ideas, but how did you bring it down and what did you come up with?
I think I was just talking about the possibility for assembly or the kind of conversation to be a proposition, and this is a sort of armature, so trying to play into that idea of the way this thing was broken down into fragments, and there was this kind of idea of breaking something down while also bringing people together as a sort of, idea. And in its way, kind of the contradictions of that in dealing with something like the conservation of this building, which is quite complicated and involves that kind of like physical process of breaking and repair. Maybe not clear, but yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. And N.A. is going to stay on stage because we're going to be looking at her text next.
Okay, great, thank you. And can I invite Helen onto the stage? Thank you.
Thanks.
Ellis.
So this is our final text of the afternoon. Thank you for staying with us.
We're going to do a little swap over here. Ellis is going to take over.
Thomas.
All right, so hi everyone, my name's N.A. I'm a Part 1 architectural assistant, and my piece is about Nomadland, Welcome to Nomadland, which was in the Arsenale, and it was created by Laboratoire architects, and it's basically focusing on how architecture can accommodate to nomads and just also highlighting the issues with current architecture at the moment in regards to nomads. So if I read the first bit. So the Laboratory of the Future is this year's theme for the 18th Venice Biennale, created by British Ghanaian architect and writer Leslie Loco. The exhibit was established in 1895 and is today acknowledged as one of the most prestigious cultural institutions, consisting of 89 practitioners, and a 50-50 gender balance, of which over half are from Africa or from the African diaspora, one of the largest seen in history of the Biennale. This is a radical change which is needed as it sheds light on a place that we all know of, but we know little about. Piano, sorry, my Italian's not that great. And that's a quote from the president of the Biennale. Yeah, so that's the first paragraph.
Thank you, N.A. And thank you for being brave enough to, because one of the things as a writer is that one often comes across foreign terms and uses them, and it often trips people up, but that's where the editorial process is important, to have different, and I don't speak Italian either, but I think it's contropiano, thank you. Oh yeah. So, shall I begin? I think that this is a really good introduction to the Biennale. It's concise. You've got all of the significant information in there. You've also got an interesting quotation, which I think is actually a slightly provocative quotation.
Okay.
That's not necessarily a bad thing. Yeah. But anyway, maybe let's leave that conversation for a minute. But I wonder if, to reiterate the parameters of this exercise, it's a 700-word piece about one part of the Biennale. So you can choose to start wide and focus in, but I wonder if you could move this paragraph later on. Yeah, okay. So that you then, so that you take us straight to the Nomadland exhibit, and then later on you expand on the Biennale that it's part of.
Mm-hmm. That's my impulse to that. Yeah, I think you're missing I think I was saying to people yesterday that in journalistic, if you go to journalism school, they tell you about the nut graph. And the kind of the rule of writing is writing journalism is often that you can say whatever you want in the first paragraph as long as you get the reader's attention. But then kind of about 150, 200 words in, you give them the paragraph which, is asking the questions that the piece is going to go on to answer. But this opening paragraph, in any piece, it's got to be about putting the reader into it's got to be evocative, and it's got to kind of feel concrete and kind of physical, and can be I'd like to, as Tom says, it's a good description of the Biennale, but maybe you're not reviewing the Biennale, you're reviewing this quite specific, but one particular element of it. So I think I'd like to see something a bit higher up, which is a kind of description of that puts the reader in there. Have you got something there that you feel that feels like a kind of descriptive of?
I think the next paragraph, maybe you can switch that around, because it talks about Nomadland, and I think it gives you all the key information that the whole review should be about. Maybe that can switch around.
I mean, even that is, you're talking about the themes of the exhibition, but I'm just wondering if there's something even a bit more experiential, that's, yes, that's looking good.
I mean, we're getting into the concrete details now of the exhibit, and I think that's very useful for situating the reader in the space. I wonder if the white plastic chairs are might be the thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting.
Now, there's a possibility here of making too much of something for dramatic effect as a writer. However, part of our job as a writer is to produce a little bit of drama. So sometimes you can make something a bit more exciting than maybe it even was in reality. And I'm not saying that about the exhibit in general. I mean the plastic chairs, because you would have to be a strange person to be very excited by white plastic chairs. But what is interesting maybe about the white plastic chairs in this context?
It's the fact that you wouldn't, when you first approach the exhibit, you wouldn't think that it's part of the exhibit. You would just think it's like a normal seating area. But the creators deliberately chose white plastic chairs to represent what you would see in these camps, these nomad camps. So it kind of creates a more personal approach in regards to the exhibit, and yeah, it kind of transports you to the camps in a way, but yeah, not exactly.
Yeah. So I think that you could do a little bit of embroidery around the chairs, and I think that also the other thing that's fairly okay, so I'm exaggerating. It's not that striking, but they're cheap plastic chairs. They're cheap plastic chairs that you might find outside a cheap restaurant or on a campsite. And this is where I might be pushing it too far, and I think we talked about this a little bit in the space. You can move them around.
Yeah, you can, yeah.
And I think you could make something of that. They're mobile furniture. It's not like the fixed, solid seating areas that you would get in a normal gallery. They're not expensive. They're not fancy.
Yeah, and that kind of represents the whole nomad lifestyle as well. So looking at conversation between the chairs and the nomadic lifestyle might be interesting. Yeah.
I might also be, I don't know if you've done it maybe, but I haven't seen anything where you're describing the pavilion.
Okay.
You know, and I think maybe I think it's a particularly beautiful, not a particularly beautiful building.
It's in the Cordery.
It's in the Cordery, sorry, okay.
I mean, it's a beautiful building, but it's not a...
But that would be good to get something of the contrast maybe between, the unexpectedness of encountering these white, kind of painted, these white chairs, plastic chairs, kind of in the. I think we just need something. We need something that's kind of allowing us to imagine the environment, and so I think we need even just half a line about the space that we're in.
So yeah, maybe the contrast between the grandeur of the Cordery, the scale, this enormous building, and then you've got these little, very humble plastic chairs. And like I said, you can go too far with these things, but yeah, maybe a line or something would try and create a sensation of what it's like to be there.
Yeah, sounds good.
Helen, do you have any thoughts about the plastic chairs? I'm sorry, I don't want to keep on going on about them, but or about the intro in general.
I understand that maybe coming into the space, you might see that it might be a bit ambiguous initially, but then I like that she mentions the cultural elements of nomadic architecture that readers may not be aware of, or even visitors might not be aware of at the beginning. So, yeah.
So that's leading us into our next bit, where you take off from your plastic chairs into the world of the people that's being represented here. Thank you.
I mean, why don't can we try taking that paragraph that begins your attention, and let's see what happens if we put that at the top?
In fact, you do. I mean, sorry, I should have scrolled up a bit, because you have already said it's transporting us into the site of the nomad. So we're halfway there.
So that the first line would need a little bit of tweaking.
So, yes. I mean, I'm sort of slightly riffing off the last one, and I don't want to imitate it or sound too much like it, but something like, halfway down but you can't say that because we've just had a piece that begins like that. But, in the grand in the enormous, in the vast. And I wouldn't normally do this because I don't want to put my words in your mouth.
Yeah, no, definitely.
I mean, I'm not suggesting that this is how you should write it, but this is just perhaps one way of giving a bit of emotional weight to these very lightweight plastic chairs.
Full only midway down the length of the cavernous cautery. Approved wording.
That D with an I wasn't lying when I said I didn't speak Italian. And I barely speak English by the look of it. Here we go. So this introduces the element of mystery, which is so important to the work of art as, can't remember who said that now, but also to journalism. Because if you can produce a mystery, it was André Breton, then you can sort of draw people in a bit because they want to find out what's going on.
Something like, collection of modest plastic chairs stands forlornly midway down the length of the cavernous cautery, part of this year's Architettura Biennale di Venezia. They might maybe just stay. Their presence is ambiguous, possibly seating area, possibly artistic installation. They've been deliberately incorporated to represent ordinary elements of nomadic architecture and manifest.
We've got these ideas which we've extracted from your later paragraph. By moving them to the beginning, we've sort of introduced the reader into the physicality of the space first.
Yeah.
And I think that we've done it in a fairly
brutal
and haphazard way, and you could do it much better. But I do think that now that we've introduced this opening that's a bit more concrete, but also a bit more draws people in a bit more to the sensation of being in the space, this would then be the time to talk, to expand on where we are actually.
Ellis?
Or Helen?
Yeah.
So maybe the remarkable wall piece can go down a bit further.
Yeah, I'm with that. So we go down to, in response to the theme, welcome in nomad land. Curated by La Laboratoire Architecture at Tunisium Monet Aoud, the French Vanessa Lascelle. That's good.
Could you be a bit more punchy? Say something like, this is the work of action research project, action research practice.
I have a question about action research because it's a bit unclear to me.
Mm-hmm.
Is that, I guess that's the way they describe it themselves, yeah. And I guess they're trying to make it sound like they're not just drawing maps.
Yeah, I think, yeah, so they're trying to like, they're doing research, but they're actually doing more than just research, but actually like physically moving beyond that, I think that's what they're trying to explain.
And are they physically intervening in these spaces? Could you say it was like an activist research project? I think what I'm getting at is that I think I don't really know what an action research project is, and it's a phrase that they've come up with. But I think sometimes we need to reinterpret what curators say for the public, because curators often, and I apologize to curators in the room, but they often speak in a weird language of their own that the public doesn't speak.
Mm.
And one of the jobs of a journalist is to try and translate
what that means.
Yeah, yeah.
That's fair.
Hi, I just had a quick question. I would just love to hear a bit more from you, N.A., what the central theme that you were trying to convey in this process, and just to understand a bit more of your voice in regards to why you wanted to speak about the nomadic topic in particular, and maybe as to why you chose the white plastic chair, because I thought that was quite a symbolic. I mean, I think your choice of language there was quite powerful, and I would just love to understand a little bit more of your choices behind the piece.
Okay, so the reason why I chose to look at nomads, mainly because like my interpretation of architecture was quite just like, especially homes, is something that's permanent and you can't like really move around a bit. But in regards to like looking at the broader context, for example, when you're looking at like planning and urbanization, planners don't really take into account people of different cultural lifestyles. And the reason why, in my opinion, is because it's kind of considered like other, and it's like what I'm trying to get out of this piece is like, we should be looking at accommodating for everyone rather than just accommodating for what we know, because by like marginalizing these groups based on like their way of life, I don't think that's what architecture should be about. And then looking at how nomads actually move around and what they consider architecture to be, like we can like tie the two together. Yeah, that's what I was trying to, I don't know if it makes sense, but yeah, that's what I was trying to get out.
And if I could, I might zoom forwards actually in this instance to the end of the piece, because something that you did, which I really liked, was to, and we haven't had a chance to look at the ends of the other pieces, so this is something that our other writers might have done as well, is to, at the end, zoom out again from the exhibit to its implications for the world or for architecture more broadly speaking, and you were just touching on that and by explaining what your interest was in the piece, and I think you explained that clearly at the end. In this final paragraph, so saying what we might take from this exhibit, and also at the same time tying it back into the wider themes of the Biennale, questions of decarbonisation. Does anyone have any? We've sort of come to the end of our final time slot. Does anyone have any last questions, comments? Helen, perhaps, or Ellis, or anyone in the audience?
Well, I'd just like to say how brave everyone has been for standing up, coming up on stage and going through this process in public, which is, rather, I can imagine, quite daunting. But I think kind of also the public nature of it does, for as someone from in the audience, I definitely think there is a lot that can be learned from just the dialogue. But and of course, I'm very conscious that we're making very brutal incisions into a piece of text which you've laboured on, kind of, and is work in progress. So thank you for letting us be pushing it around.
It's all right. Thank you for your feedback. It's useful. I really enjoyed the conversation. It's thought-provoking as well, because I wouldn't really rearranged it, so it's nice to see how other people organize things, so I can learn from that. So yeah, it's fine. It's good.
Thank you.
Nice.
I think it's also worth, I'd say, would be worth going and having a read of some other exhibition reviews of the kinds that if the brief here is to do something that might appear in Wallpaper magazine, let's have a read of their exhibition reviews, and you'll see these kind of techniques that we've been talking about, I think, being applied. So yeah, I think reading is always sort of the best tool for learning how to write.
I think that's a good note to end on. Thank you, Ellis, and thank you, Helen, and thank you, N.A., and thank you all of the members who are on stage and not on stage. Yeah, please come up.
Can you all come up? It'd be nice to come on. Come on, Mia, Feria, Leila, Maya. Because I know that we've now dwindled in our numbers from what we had at one point, maybe 100, 120 people. But it's been, as you've all identified, quite excruciating to have you on stage. So I just think it'd be quite nice to celebrate you all. And a big round of applause to the new architecture writers. Thanks, everyone. Thank you.